And welcome back. We've come to a very special part of the conference, the keynote address, which I think is really appropriate since the morning we spent a little time learning about Leontief inverses and maximum likelihood estimation of Kalman filter. It's maybe time for somebody to step back and provide a little bit of a contextual context for what the theme is about. And I don't think there's a better person that's suited for that than our keynote speaker, Paul Antras, who is a Robert G. Ory Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, where he served as the director of the International Trade and Organization Working Group. Also a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research and a member of the CES IFO Research Network. Paul served as an editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics from 2015 to 2020. He's a member of the Scientific Council of the Barcelona School of Economics. And among many other distinctions, he was awarded an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship in 2007 and the Fundación Banco Herrera Prize in 2009. He's an elected fellow of the Econometric Society as of 2015, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2024. Paul's teaching and research fields are international economics and applied theory, and his most recent work focuses on global value chains, the interplay between globalization and interest rates, globalization and market power, and international relations, topics that are very much at the heart of this conference. As a Spanish citizen, Paul received his BA and master's degree from economics at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and his PhD also in economics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's my great pleasure to welcome Paul to give our keynote. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Egon. Thank you, the organizers more broadly, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be here. As Egon kind of hinted, I was asked to give a non-technical presentation, so it's going to be a bit of a higher level than some of the stuff we saw this morning, and the themes is going to be about the evolving role of the U.S. in global value chains. So let me tell you, give you a brief roadmap of what I want to do in the next 40 minutes. First, I'm just going to tell you things you know, okay? But sometimes it's helpful to see things you know and sort of have to fix ideas, see some figures. So I'm going to describe with a very long-run perspective in mind where is the U.S. in the world economy and where is the U.S. in GVCs. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the economics of global value chains. That is how an economist like myself thinks about this concept of global value chains. Again, it's going to be non-technical, but it will be a bit more conceptual in terms of what I think are some of the main themes in this literature. Then, towards the end, I want to obviously turn to the current situation, describe briefly how I see the current policy environment. And then I'm going to end with some speculative observations, trying to map what I will have said conceptually, empirically, and how I think we might walk out of the current situation. So it's going to be very speculative. I might run out of time, but we can do the Q&A, and you can press me to get my speculations there. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is overview long-run trends. Let's start with the basics. The U.S. economy, if something defines the U.S. economy in the last 50 years, which happens to be my lifetime, since 1975, is its stability. Okay, if you plot log real GDP, log price indices, it's very steady growth. So that also reminds me, when one speaks at the branch of a Federal Reserve, one has to do so with great humility, in the sense that this is clearly a story of a success in managing the U.S. economy. In terms of the weight of the U.S. economy, in terms of the whole world economy, we hear a lot of talk about making America great again. Well, in terms of shares of GDP, I think the U.S. is basically where it was 50 years ago. About a quarter of the world economy is accounted for by the U.S. Certainly, it was higher right after the Second World War for good reasons. There were some peaks maybe in the mid-'80s and maybe early 2000s. But the U.S. is still a massive, very significant share of the world economy. Now, this could have played differently. Okay, it's always important to remember this. We have economies like Japan, which in the 1980s looked very strong, but if you look at the same series of GDP per capita, price levels, things don't look so good. There's a clear deceleration in growth. There's episodes of deflation. So obviously, the world economy was facing shocks that could have affected the US economy very differently than what it did. Similarly, in terms of shares of world GDP, I've shown you the US one. The story of Japan is different. That slowdown basically led to a less and less important share of world GDP accounted for by Japan. And the story of China is a story of ascent, coming basically out of nowhere. It's reached percentages of world GDP that are close to 20%. Turning to trade, not just GDP, but trade, if we look at the US share in world trade, that is a little bit clearer that there's been a little bit of a decline in the 21st century. Starting with shares between 13 and 15%, it seems that the US share in world trade has stabilized around 11%. Okay? It is important to point out, however, that this is not a story of becoming more isolated. If I look at standard measures of trade openness, trade economies like particularly the ratio of trade to GDP, trade here is going to be an average of exports and imports divided by GDP. This is a story of fairly steady growth, at least up to the great financial crisis. Okay, so if anything, the US has become more open in the sense of selling abroad more of what it produces and buying from abroad more of what it consumes. So what is going on, right? You might be confused about, we are smaller in world markets, but we're more open. Obviously, the key is that the rest of the world became even more open than we did. Okay, the ratio of US to world trade has been growing at the world level and at a faster rate on average than that in the US. You see the last few years since the great financial crisis, this ratio in the world has been kind of steady. It sort of declined a little bit. It led to some debates about deglobalization, but I think there's a sense that if deglobalization is to happen, it hasn't happened yet. Similarly, if the US is going to decouple from world markets, it may happen, but it hasn't really happened significantly up to this point. This higher growth of world trade in other countries is particularly well represented by China, or particularly driven by China. China growing a lot and being quite export-oriented. Indeed, if we look at the share of U.S. and China in world trade, China already caught up to the U.S. Okay, in recent years, there certainly have been years where China has traded more with the rest of the world than the U.S. You might be confused about this figure. I'm averaging exports and imports. If your view was, well, on the export side, they caught up and they surpassed this way before, that is true. That is, if you look at exports, the U.S. Export share is significantly lower than the Chinese one. Okay, so yes, we have become more open, but there's other countries that have actually become even more open or that have surpassed us in exports. Another point to make is cross-sectional, less on the time series, but cross-sectionally, it's true that if we are to think that the trade to GDP ratio is a measure of openness, according to this measure, and I don't know, the slides show up a little bit different here than in my copy, but hopefully you see the U.S. here on the far right. We see that the U.S. appears to be relatively less open than other OECD countries, for instance. Okay. Now, obviously, trade economists understand that this is not an issue of tariffs or protectionism. It's the sheer size of the U.S. economy is naturally going to make it less open to trade, but it's clearly on the right side. And maybe this sort of fuels this rhetoric that Shebnem was trying to push against, which is we're so little open to the rest of the world that we're not exposed to foreign forces. So to summarize what I've said so far, the U.S. remains the largest economy in the world. It has become more and more open to trade, but less so than other countries. It appears somewhat insulated and perhaps more so than other OECD economies, and there is little evidence that the U.S. economy is decoupling from the rest of the world. Okay, so that's the very, very broad picture. I'm going to turn to GVCs, but before doing that, let me just say a word about labor markets, okay, again, before I talk about global value chain. So that's less about broad forces, but how do trade economists think about the interplay between trade and globalization and the U.S. labor market. The first point to notice is that if you just look at unemployment rates, the U.S. unemployment rate has been pretty stable. Obviously ups and downs, but we know that this ups and downs and the very high spike of COVID, there's good reasons why that happened, and we tend to think that those are largely orthogonal to trade. If you kind of use Fred data, for instance, the episodes of high increases in unemployment rate, they're very much tied to recessions. If you correlate this with the blue series, which is a measure of import penetration, imports over GDP, it's hard to tease out any correlation between the series. If anything, you'd probably infer that periods of more globalization are associated with less unemployment. So I think there's little evidence that the overall unemployment rate is largely affected by trade. Now, obviously, there's been lots of debates, both in the policy world and in academia, about certain types of employment. Okay, even if there's no impact on unemployment, there is a very noticeable fact in the U.S. labor market, which is that manufacturing employment has been on the decline, both in absolute terms, but especially relative to total U.S. non-farm employment. So starting with a quarter of the labor force being in manufacturing, the year I was born, we're down to less than 10% of the labor force in manufacturing. Many reasons why that has happened. First point to notice is this is not just unique to the U.S. Okay? Even when I look at the share of manufacturing in value added in GDP, this has been on steady decline in many countries. Economists often call this structural transformation, moving from manufacturing to services. It is noticeable, however, that this downward trend is disproportionately higher in the U.S. relative to other economies. And in fact, perhaps partly related to this, there's an active and sort of still quite active and very influential literature that has argued, I think quite persuasively, that there's perhaps a causal link between this decline in manufacturing employment and increases in trade, and in particular, increases in trade of the U.S. with China. Okay, so work by Otterthorn and Hansen exploiting cross-sectional variation of the impact of the China shock in different local labor markets in the U.S., showing that areas that were more exposed to the China shock because they were producing things that were more in line with what the Chinese were getting better at, featured lower unemployment rate, lower manufacturing employment, work by Piers and Pete Schott, who's somewhere here, over there, exploiting cross-sectional variation in terms of at the industry level, showing similarly that manufacturing employment declined by more in industries that were more exposed to the China shock. This literature tells you there's two series. They're clearly negatively correlated. Maybe there's something beyond correlations. Maybe the China shock actually drove down manufacturing. Why is that, right? If I showed you the OECD data shows that the U.S. economy seems to be quite insulated from trade. Well, you know, as sort of Shebnam alluded to and sort of hinted at, you know, when you start disaggregating, there's much more exposure. You could go very, very disaggregated, and we all know we're very exposed to rare earths because we need to import them. But even at something as aggregated as manufacturing, we start seeing more and more exposure. If I look at the ratio of imports to exports in manufacturing over manufacturing value added in the US, these shares are not 10%. For exports, it's about 40%, if I'm reading this right. For imports, it's close to 90%. Now, you might say you're kind of comparing oranges to apples to oranges, and that's value added versus gross output. If I compute something more standard, which we call an import penetration ratio, think about the share of domestic absorption that comes from imports in manufacturing. This is not 10%. This is more than 35%. Okay, so a very significant weight of imports in domestic consumption and manufacturing. We often call this, we predict that we are more exposed to import competition. What foreigners do and how they compete with that can have very significant impacts on US manufacturing, and that's been the intellectual basis for interpreting why US manufacturing might have been exposed to the China shock. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to this, but before I do that, let me tell you now about the narrower topic of global value chains, which is what I was asked to wait on. So as a matter of background, the way I see it is maybe not among the people in the room necessarily, but when I've talked to policymakers and when I read the press, I often think that a lot of the thinking on the impact of trade, and more recently the impact of tariffs, appears to be partly based on sort of an outdated view of the world. This view of import competition. We had this furniture producers, maybe in North Carolina, they were doing just fine, and China entered the WTO. We could import furniture from China, and this North Carolina producers were wiped out, and all those jobs were gone, and they're not coming back. So it's this idea of trade with other countries where we're importing these goods, and the local producers of those goods suffer from this competition. You know, it is a natural way to think about it that goes back to David Ricardo. David Ricardo, we're thinking about the, you know, why do countries trade with each other, thought, you know, devised the concept of comparative advantage, but it's sort of a conceptual framework that's very much based on the idea that we're producing in different sectors, we import from foreign countries certain sectors, we export to them some other sectors. And these sectors might be somewhat linked through general equilibrium forces. Shemnem, I can say general equilibrium, it's okay. It's not that technical of a word. But you know, we tend to think about sectors somewhat more separate from each other. Now, the way that I think many trade economists think these days, certainly I'm in that camp, is sort of shaped by a set of phenomena that started happening in the early 1980s that basically led to a pretty drastic transformation of the world economy. Essentially, we saw this fragmentation of productions across borders by which instead of exchanging finished products, cars, furniture, this and that, we basically took production processes that had largely been carried out domestically and we started doing different parts of the production in different places. And as a result, when I look at customs forms in the US, I'm not just seeing imports of cars from Mexico or imports of furniture from China. Very often what I'm seeing are intermediate inputs, components, things that are slices of much larger global value chains. In addition, in that process of fragmentation of production processes, in the governing of this global value chains that now dominate world trade, it is also well established that these are basically dominated, that these relationships are dominated by a relatively small set of very large firms. So firms have played a very key role in shaping these global value chains, which again creates a bit of disconnect in thinking about this at the country sector level, which is what Shemnem was doing in her paper. And that's led part of the literature to migrate to models that emphasize much more firm level decisions rather than comparative advantage at, say, the country sector level. Now, conceptually, I'm not going to give you models. There's no time, and I think that's probably not the right forum. But let me briefly describe, in very broad terms, a particular taxonomy of global value chains. How do you move from this broad concept of sort of slicing global value chains, of buying inputs from abroad, of exporting? How do you move to frameworks that formalize that in a simple way? And one way that I found very useful in my own work is a taxonomy that was first suggested by Baldwin and Venables in a paper in 2013, which said maybe we want to think about two broad types of global value chains. Some that look like snakes and some that look like spiders. So all of you know what a spider looks like. Okay, so it looks something like this. If you were a bit sleepy after lunch, I'm going to wake you up pretty quickly. And this is what a snake looks like, okay? So that's what it looks to you. What it looks to me, a spider looks more something like this, okay? Which is a production process that has a core part, the assembly, and then there's all these legs that converge to this core, which are bringing the parts and components into the assembly plant. An example would be the production of an airplane. Boeing has an assembly plant in Washington State, but obviously that plant is not doing all the parts of the plane. A lot of the parts are coming into the US. That had always been done. Planes were produced with hundreds of parts that were sourced from many places, but mostly in the US. When devising the Dreamliner a few years ago, Boeing moved to a different system where it was buying bigger chunks of the plane, and many of those were actually coming from abroad. So it's been estimated that about 70% of the parts of a Boeing aircraft are actually sourced from abroad. Okay, so this is a global value chain in the sense that when the US exports Boeing planes to other countries, those planes are going to embody a lot of foreign value added that was added in all the countries that you see listed there. Okay, and it's become really a global production process. Another example would be the production of the F-150. Some of you that might watch American football, I don't know this year, but last year had this commercials with a guy with a very deep voice talking about how Ford was 100% committed to being 100% in America, or rather assembled in America. That is a pretty meaningful caveat. There's also the fine print, right? What your parents told you, always read the fine print. So it turns out that if people have estimated the percentage of value of the F-150 that is actually US value added, and it's only about 55%. And as you know, the F-150 is a popular car in the US, but Ford produces many other cars that are very popular in other countries. I grew up in Spain driving a Ford Fiesta. Is that produced in the US? No, that was produced in Spain, in Valencia. And in fact, only about 40% of the Ford vehicles are assembled in the US. What do I mean by that? I mean that Ford is a company that, when trying to sell American branded products to the US, has laid out all these webs of spiders with all these assembly plants worldwide where the parts and components are converging. Okay, so maybe Ford should have said we're 40% committed to the US, but that probably would not sell all that well. What is a snake? A snake is also going to be a global value chain, but what makes it distinctive is that rather than having like this assembly and all these things converging there, these are production processes that we really want to dig a little bit deeper into the multiple stages that lead to final consumption or the final good. An example of that, and one that I've been sort of discussing over the years, but one that is particularly relevant to discuss these days, is the case of chips. Which Tommaso was talking about already, which, as you know, it's a production process that, ends up with a chip, but there's a lot of things that need to happen before the chip is put into your phone or into your car or into a drone. It ranges from the sourcing of the raw materials, the silicon, the purification of the silicon, the wafer fabrication, which is the core of the industry. But even after wafer fabrication, you're going to have to assemble the chips, cut them into boxes, send them to the end users. You could dig deeper and go to the wafer fabrication. The wafer fabrication is going to require some machines that to kind of allow the process to be highly precise. So it's a sequence of stages that need to happen in a predetermined manner. And what the history of the growth of global values chains is one where these parts of production that used to happen nearby, think about like an assembly line almost like in the same factory, this thing has been sliced across borders, and now the different stages are produced in different countries. And when we look at trade statistics, what we're seeing is slices of these things. We see, the silicon being exported, the ingot of silicon being exported to the wafer fabrication plant. That's just one slice of a much longer production process. I mentioned farms, and I'll illustrate that in a second, but the semiconductors industry is very much one where you don't necessarily want to think about semiconductors as a sector. You might want to understand who are the players in that sector. In part is because of issues of understanding the decisions that go into the industries, but it might be relevant for issues that Susan was talking about at the beginning about diversification or lack thereof. As you know, NVIDIA has been one of the it's the largest company by market value at this point in time. It's specialized in very precise type of chips that at this point in time only TSMC in Taiwan can produce. We also know that TSMC in producing those chips requires certain types of very specialized machinery that are only produced by ASML in the Netherlands. In producing those machines, they need certain lenses that are only produced by Zeiss in Germany. So this is a story where, to understand all these nodes, you really want to understand these firms and where do they emerge, where do they produce, could they be producing in more than one country like TSMC now producing chips in Arizona. So that's basically how we think about them, and we've devised frameworks to think about that. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but let me move from examples to more of how does that aggregate in the data. And okay, you're telling me that global value chains are somewhat distinct from trade. If I look at how the US is embedded in this global value chains, how does that look relative to the trade openness measure that I was telling you before? So there's various ways to document this. I'm going to start with what we call US backward GVC participation. This is basically your Boeing example of instead of producing planes in the US and exporting them, and it's all US value added, we bring in foreign components and those are embodied in the exported goods. So it's foreign value added in exports. You see that's been fairly stable. It grew and it sort of went down a little bit, but at fairly moderate low levels. If I looked at manufacturing, that's the blue series, it's a little bit higher, okay? So we are using more non-trivial amount foreign value added in our exports, but it's not a lot, okay? And that partly reflects that a lot of the manufacturing has actually, there's been a non-trivial share of manufacturing migrated out of the US. When I look at forward GVC participation, the percentages are much, much higher. What is forward GVC participation? This is going to be goods that are exported in the US, but they're not going straight to final consumers abroad. They're used by producers abroad to produce goods that then are exported to other countries. Okay? So that may be some manufacturing, but there's a lot of services here. Obviously, there's innovation services, financial services, et cetera. And that the US is very much a key player in this aspects of global value chains. That is, I've already kind of hinted at this, but if you compare GVC integration of the US versus other countries, in terms of backward integration, it looks like my OECD trade share graph, but if I look at forward GVC participation, we're on the other side. Okay, so yeah, we're maybe trade to GDP ratio is not very high, but if you think that GVCs are dominating more and more world trade, we are key players on some aspects of it, and I think that's something important to argue. Then you can add those measures. I don't know if the right thing is to do is to add them, then it doesn't look so impressive, but you know, I think this aspect that I'm pointing out here is particularly relevant. Now, brief aside, this is almost like something that I was expecting Aaron to say this morning, but he chose to be super, super, super kind. So I'm going to be, I'm going to be kind, but I'm going to be a little bit less kind, and sort of remind you that we need to treat all these things with a grain of salt, in the sense that I'm giving you measures of GVC participation that are based on enormous efforts of people of constructing this so-called world input-output tables, which I think are partly behind Shebnem's calculations, which I think about them, it's a matrix, I mean, there's a lot to read there, but basically it's a set of input-output tables that not only tell you how much wood does the US furniture business or industry use, but it does the same at a global level. So the US furniture industry might use Canadian wood and wood from other countries. So it's all these input-output coefficients at both the industry and the country level. Now, this is data that does not exist. I mean, it's a data that is created based on data that exists. Very good customs level data, very good input-output table, but fairly aggregated. But then there's a bunch of assumptions that are made to construct the numbers that are behind all those figures. So the way that I describe this to my students at Harvard is I describe it as a kind of a sausage, in the sense that it looks good, it tastes good, but you probably don't want to know how they made it, okay? So, and you know, the reason I mention Aaron is some of his recent work is actually very nicely illustrating how if one goes at the firm level, at firm-to-firm transactions and things like that, one sees some obvious biases in these measures. And the biases, for reasons that I probably don't have time to go into, tend to underestimate the extent to which the US is embedded in these global value chains. In a nutshell, what happened is that the same firms that are exporting a lot from the US, those are the same firms that tend to import a lot. So our exports are embodying much more foreign value added than you would infer based on averages. Why the average? And I mean, it's a little bit subtle, so I'm not going to get into it, but there's good reasons why when you dig at the firm level, you're going to infer a much more exposure to foreign forces. In my own work, using a similar sort of data that Aaron has used, we've documented this in a different way, which is looking at the sheer dominance of multinational firms in US manufacturing. If we look at firms that do some manufacturing in the US, we have about 250,000 firms, of which only 1.5%, about 3,750 of them, are multinationals. Either they have foreign affiliates, they're US-based and have foreign affiliates, or they're foreign multinationals that have affiliates in the US. Even though there's only 3,750 of these firms in all these various manufacturing sectors, these firms account for 57% of the employment of these firms. This is not US employment of these firms. And they account for more than 3/4 of the sales of these firms, and they account for about between 80 and 90% of US imports and of exports of manufacturing goods. Okay, so if you want to understand aggregates, you don't need to think about thousands and thousands of firms. These guys are basically driving all the aggregates. And you can see from the data that they're not just large exporters, they're also large importers. Now, obviously, these are very large firms, and we know from Pete Schutt's work and any other work that large firms tend to export much more and import much more. But the fact that they're multinational is important. If you look at US-based multinationals and you look at not just what they do in the US, how much they export, they import, how much they produce locally, but you look at what they do abroad, it turns out that their foreign operations are close to 3/4 of their domestic ones. Meaning that a lot of their business, think about Ford selling cars worldwide, a lot of their business is abroad. And that tells me that firms that shape US importing and exporting, they have massive exposure to foreign markets. Again, another sort of point that perhaps the trade to GDP ratio measures might not give you all the answers. Briefly, another point, and that sort of also connects with something that Susan was saying at the beginning, the issue of diversification. We pointed out in a paper a few years ago using 2007 data that if you looked at sourcing, where are US firms doing manufacturing in the US, where are they sourcing the inputs they need for production, I gave you the example of Boeing with all these parts and they were a country of origin, and you could imagine that there's only one supplier of wings for Boeing. So that's more generally true. The median US importer is buying inputs from a single source. Okay, that's 2007 data. More recently, there's work by Beata Jaworczyk, Piers, and Wisniewski that has shown that's still true, was true in 2017. But they also pointed out something quite interesting, which is sometimes looking at the median firm is not the right thing to do. Okay, you might want to look also at what the bigger firms are doing. And they argue that if you look at the very large US importers, they don't look as much as Boeing, they tend to be much more diversified. Okay, so if, 80 to 90% of US imports are accounted for by very large companies that are diversified, it's less clear in that sense that we are as exposed to risks as you would have inferred otherwise. So taking stock, US has become more open and more integrated in GVCs, but less so than other countries, particularly in terms of backward GVC participation. Forward GVC participation is more relevant. For manufacturing, GVCs are of first order importance in shaping US output and employment. If you want to think about manufacturing employment, bear in mind the bulk of that employment is associated with firms that have non-trivial operations abroad because they are multinationals. And precisely a small number of large multinationals accounts for the vast majority of US manufacturing trade. So given this, this empirical background, let me tell you in 5 minutes, give you a sense of how do we move from here to modeling, and how do we, folks that are thinking about global value chains from a firm level perspective, how do we think about this? What do we think are the sort of things that we should expect in the data? And how do we interpret some of the evidence that we're seeing coming out from our models and from models that other people are putting on the table. So the key questions that motivate this literature is, of course, when we write down trade models, we understand there's interdependencies. Exports and imports are not separate from each other. They're tied by general equilibrium forces. But what this literature is pushing is that the interdependencies really are at the firm level or at the chain level. Can you really think about US imports of airplane wings and airplane wing tips independently from each other? No, of course, when Boeing orders numbers, these two transactions are going to have to be tied to each other because they're going to the same plane, and there's some ratios that need to be abided. Similarly, when there's shocks that happen at 2, 3, 4 downstream stages from where production happens, there's going to be an interdependency in this transaction. So when I look at customs forms, I need to understand that I can't treat those customs forms as being independently determined from customs forms that are collected from countries that may be very far away. So the short answer is no, we cannot treat them as independently. Can we ignore the key role of large firms in laying out GVCs? My answer would be no. Shebnem might disagree because the models that you don't disagree. Okay, great. So this is on the record. Yeah. You might want to come back to this in the Q&A. Can we ignore the large upfront investments associated with these GVCs? Again, if you have a geography of global value chains that is dominated by a small number of large firms that are not buying inputs from many countries, if you write down a model that's going to rationalize that, the way we write these models, it's calling for big upfront investments, which, you know, we kind of know from talking to business people that that those are relevant, but in our models, obviously, they have to be important. So modeling these things seems important. We might also ask ourselves, you know, the special features of global value chains, the fact that firms that are exporting, they're also importing, or the other way around. The firms that are importing, which we traditionally thought about, well, if we're importing things into the US, there's some import competition, someone's suffering. Well, you know, a firm like Apple is not suffering from the ability to buy the finished products from China and therefore being able to produce it more cheaply. There's certainly firms that are not treating these imports as a competition, but as an opportunity to cut costs. So that's in terms of insights. In terms of hurdles, I mean, it's not easy to do this thing relative to other types of economic models when you have situations where there's scale economies, trade costs, multiple countries where you could do sourcing, exporting, foreign assembly. These are complicated firm-level problems. This is not just about computing the big general equilibrium, but even the firm-level problem is non-trivial, and there's an active literature trying to devise ways to solve these problems. Market structures, you know, I mean, I'm holding back a little bit, but competitive models are maybe problematic as sort of the right way to kind of interpret the data. We sometimes work with models with market power and international trade, but they tend to kind of be models that are, one should be a bit have some discomfort in mapping them to industries like the semiconductors industry, where there's a very small number of players that dominate the different segments of the chain. So we may want to invoke oligopoly. Also, in these decisions of where to produce stuff, there's other decisions on how tightly to control these foreign production processes, the so-called internalization decision. Intel makes its own chips, NVIDIA doesn't. Why there's different strategies? In past work of mine, I've sort of tried to incorporate contract theoretical considerations to think about those trade-offs. But when you introduce contract theory into those models, obviously they become more and more complicated. So long story short, we have models. I could tell you about the models, but admittedly, we don't have definitive answers. Okay, so I'm not here to give you numbers of what's going to happen, because I know that the models we have limitations, and the standard errors that I would put on my estimates would be too large for you guys to find them informative. At the same time, having thought a lot about these things, I know why the sort of models that we are currently using to inform quantitatively the impact of policies might be problematic. And I'll conclude with that in a couple of minutes. So what have we learned from these models? I mean, we don't have definitive answers, but we've sort of had some insights. I mentioned before, we know we need large fixed costs and costs to match the data. We know complementarities are a dominant feature of the data. The fact that exporters and importers are the same companies, maybe it's not random. It's just the fact that firms that were exporting, they scaled up, and then they were able to kind of import, and then they were able to become big foreign assemblers. So there's a natural complementarity that engagement, foreign trade engagement leads to foreign trade engagement of other forms, which somewhat relates to what Susan was talking about, the productivity gains from globalization, okay? This complementarity actually also might explain why there's so little large firms, which is that precisely firms that are able to leverage these globalization forces are going to grow disproportionately relative to other firms, and we may end up with highly concentrated market structures. Perhaps it's not completely random. We've shown in work that import competition shocks, so for instance, a China shock might operate very differently from traditional models. Standard interpretation that China shock is an import competition shock. That's maybe why it reduces manufacturing. But if I look, for instance, like we've done with Teresa Ford and Felix Tintelnot, if you run a China shock in a model where firms are importing intermediate inputs, it's clearly that there's a right tail of the size distribution of firms that are benefiting from this, and they're generating more jobs in the US. They're cutting costs, they're buying cheaper inputs from China. That's leading them to scale up, and they might well start buying more inputs domestically or hiring more manufacturing workers. Or work by Lydia Cox, who is there, showing that in this type of models, how tariffs operate is pretty subtle. Mary Amity has some nice work on this too, and that's where her question was coming from, I think, when asking Shebnem, which is we understand it matters a lot. Are you putting the tariff on inputs or on final goods? Final good tariffs might protect your producers, but if you put upstream tariffs, and a non-trivial share of Trump 1 tariffs were on inputs rather than final goods, that's obviously going to hurt some producers. Okay, so she showed, for instance, Lydia showed in her work that the early 2000s tariffs on steel had a negative impact on downstream producers, machine producers. Aaron was talking about that, the auto industry, et cetera. And those effects were not just negative, but long-lived. Okay, so we might be very cautious in using upstream tariffs. Okay? So tariffs, especially on inputs, might distort GVCs, and the resulting higher marginal costs of these tariffs, I would argue, might have further effects through the complementarities that I argued. If I was importing something and paying a low cost for it, but now I'm facing a higher cost because of the tariffs, that's going to lead me to scale down, which might lead me to scale down in some of my exporting activities, or might lead me to buy less inputs from other sources, might lead me to shut down some other plant, and that size-reducing effects might end up with outcomes that look very different from the typical tariff protecting you and leading to you to higher activity. Okay, so it's not obvious in this line of models that the end result of a tariff or a set of tariffs or uniform tariffs is going to be more activity in the US than otherwise. You Shebnem in your paper, you had that, your tariffs were contractionary, but I was pushing you on this because it's hard to get that in traditional input-output models of the type that you were building on. And this is not just theory. There's a very nice paper by my colleague Mark Melitz with Hetmeyer and Young looking at the auto industry, at EVs in the auto industry, showing that if you put tariffs on assembly, but also on batteries, it's not obvious that that's going to redirect EV production into the US. Actually, in some of their counterfactuals, the overall amount of EV production in the US goes down, even though you're putting these tariffs to protect this. Why? Because maybe it's hard to produce batteries in the US, so unless you remove those tariffs, that's not going to work. Okay, so where does that leave me? Current environment. I've been already anticipating this. We're thinking more and more about tariffs since April, but even before, with the tariffs that were imposed during the first Trump administration. Geopolitics, I'm going to skip because Jeff is coming up next. But we know that more and more trade is sort of falling along geopolitical lines, and we've observed non-trivial changes in the structure of U.S. trade. The U.S. is not deglobalizing, I mentioned that before, but we have observed a shift of imports from China onto other countries, Vietnam, Mexico, and so on, something that Alfaro and Chor have called a great relocation. In their recent work, they've also shown that the most recent set of tariffs, the Liberation Day tariffs, have also had an impact on sources of imports. That is, we are substituting away from the set of countries that were faced with higher tariffs. So the key question, I think, and it's too bad I'm out of time, but it's, will this President Trump policies undo the China shock? We had this import competition shock. Now we seem to be putting tariffs that are reducing trade with China. Is that going to bring back manufacturing? Hopefully it's clear from my discussion of this sort of thinking in global value chains that the answers we get there are much less obvious. Okay, I'm not going to tell you yes or no, but I know that it's much more complicated. In the data, we know that for now at least, manufacturing is not coming back. So maybe it's too early to tell, but certainly there hasn't been a spike of manufacturing production as a result of the recent tariffs. I'm going to leave that for Jeff, but this is my challenge to you, Jeff. I don't know how to explain this. If I look at tariffs after Liberation Day, average effective tariff rates, they are much higher for what we would have called US-leaning countries or non-aligned countries than for the China bloc, which questions me. The second counterfactual you were doing, Shebnem, was awesome, but we seem to be in a situation where, if anything, we're beating up on our allies more than our non-allies. So I don't know if a political scientist is going to be able to make sense of this, but I'm going to, I think I'm just going to conclude saying that standard trade models predict that if tariffs persist, economic activity and manufacturing in particular should be redirected to the US. It's not happening. Perhaps it's too early to tell. Standard models of the type that Shebnem talked about without the nominal rigidities would also predict optimal uniform tariffs that are very high, 20–40% range. So the current environment looks pretty good in terms of, we managed to live by all these tariffs. There's close to no retaliation. According to these models, we are in a sweet spot. I'm not so sure. Why? Because the standard models are models that I think have features that I think are not in line with many of the things that I see when I look at the data. And, precise, I could have put your numbers are a bit better, but looking at quantitative work, trying to document the impact of tariff wars on various countries, what comes out of the standard models that ignore this firm level dimensions are optimal tariff rates of like 88% in Taiwan that to me make absolutely no sense, right? It makes sense in terms of economic mechanisms if you understand, how big market shares of Taiwan are in some sectors, but there's clearly something missing in these models, let alone the geopolitics of we all know what would happen if Taiwan put a 90% tariff on the US. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, this was great. I think we have about 15 minutes or so. We have some time for some questions, right? So why don't I'll collect a few if that's it. We're going to kind of work this way. Start here. Yes, please.
How do you think about the role of exchange rates in thinking about whether you should really expect some of the manufacturing to come back to the United States or not? I understand that the focus is on tariffs, but in reality, the effective price or cost is what matters in determining whether the value-add chain wants to bring something back or not. Thank you.
Okay. Can I have Karsten here and then Shebnem?
Thank you. And thank you for the nice presentation. Just to comment on standard models, I'm not sure that standard models in general can address, or they can, but I'm not sure it's been done, the tariffs going up and down and up and down and up and down. We as economists are even confused from one day to the other of what's going on. Most standard models are, there is some sustainability to the tariff. And the other one I wanted to just mention is the spider and the snake. There is also an issue about policy, endogenous policy and policy responses to this. And there, perhaps we're seeing now a fragmentation of the political trade situation into hubs and spokes, where there's some nations that are becoming senders and others are signing into these hubs, i.e. the spokes. Thank you.
Okay. Let's take Shebnem and then Paul will.
This is great. Since you just raised a couple issues and then I realized maybe I wasn't clear during my presentation. I fully agree on the whole firm level and how the input-output data we have is kind of this sausage. But I would disagree that we do want to understand how the sausage made so that we can do better, right? So again, this came also during Aaron's talk. Our model is firm level monopolistic competition, and there's a very serious pricing structure there, even without the rigidities, right? I mean, so it is never meant to be like this kind of sector level model. So it is global general equilibrium, but it is, there's a firm level pricing decision. And here, how I'm going to differ from you. That firm you can take as a multinational. I mean, multinational is also in our paper because we obviously going to have the capital flow side of it, and then that's, FDI is going to be a big part. What is important, I think, the way we do it, and we are limited by the input-output matrix, I fully agree. We would love to have it firm to firm, but it's just not going to exist firm to firm. And if you just say, you know what, I still don't need firm to firm everyone, as long as I have 2,000 US multinationals, I can do this. That I would disagree. You can learn a lot from that, but I would disagree because it is just going to be the price at the border, right? So we know from all this very detailed micro work that there is this entire domestic distribution side, like Felix's wine paper, for example. They studied 2018 wine imports, like getting amazing data from the largest importers and retailers in the United States. And you start with 25%, you end up 7% price increase on the consumer. And in that process, there are several sets of markups. So our point is like, let's put all that in the model, have the model as detailed as you have, and let's work on the data. So you do global general equilibrium with firm level data, Right now we do it with the input output because this just doesn't exist, that's why. But I fully agree with you that how largest firms, largest players price this, not just on the import-export margin, but also domestically, is at the end what is going to help Susan when she thinks about inflation output trade-off. That's what we want to do. My entire career is about bringing firm level data to answer macro policy questions, right? Our point is to answer that macro policy question, inflation output trade-off, you need more than what is happening on the border and who is the large player there. I mean, model incorporates all that, but it comes down to what you do in the data. The geopolitical thing is also a very good one, right? It's endogenously going to change. I mean, Jeff is going to tell us more. The examples we put out there is all based on the existing work of Laura, Gita, They are saying, okay, this is how he's changing. We'll say, okay, let's take these authors' word and then see within that change, once you have these, cost shocks, cost push shocks, markup shocks, and all that, and how it's going to change everything. So in that sense, I think, we fully agree. The problem is not having the enough micro level data. Not, I think the models. We can go very flexible and detailed with the models, bringing this global value chain structure. I mean, that's the whole idea. And I said the parts and assembly, we all have it because it's off the back and forth. That's the second round and the nonlinearity. That's why those numbers end up being large, exactly because of the channels you are suggesting.
Okay. Why don't I let Paul answer these questions, and we'll do another round.
Perfect. So thanks for engaging. They're great questions. So the first one on exchange rates, that's a hard one for me. Okay, but so let's go back first to how do we think about the links between tariff and exchange rates. So typically, and that certainly was the case in the first Trump administration, we typically expect the tariffs to come with a dollar appreciation. Okay, which if anything is not going to be helpful for bringing back manufacturing. So some people saw some sort of inconsistency if you look at the Mar-a-Lago Accord documents and so on. On the one hand, we want to bring back stuff, but we want tariffs, and it leads to an appreciation. And then Liberation Day comes in, and it's like, okay, the dollar depreciates big time. So what's happening? Is it that our models are not good at predicting the impact of tariffs on the exchange rate? My reading is different, which is we all saw what happened on Liberation Day, and it looked a tariff shock, but it also looked like an institutional shock. Okay, and that obviously is gonna, it's gonna lead to ramifications. It's gonna lead to increases in uncertainty and lots of things that might be making people pull out of the U.S. And that's why a depreciation happened. And it's still a few months later, the dollar's not where it was. Is that going to bring back manufacturing? So we can debate about whether that was purposeful or not. I don't know. I don't know how important that is. Is that going to bring back manufacturing? It hasn't. My sense, and again, I'm going to come back to this when I talk to Shebnem, is this type of small percentage tariffs, effective tariff rates. I didn't look at the levels, but they're not huge. They're not 40, 50%. Exchange rate movements of 5, 10%. I just don't think that's big enough to bring back sufficient manufacturing. I'm going to come back to this in a second. Karsten, tariff volatility, I don't know. I mean, if you can think about optimal policy, optimal tariffs in those frameworks, what's behind actually the announced policies, It's a political process, idiosyncrasies. I think it's fascinating. I think political scientists, people in political economy, we're going to try to develop frameworks to think about, do we have the right models to think about what's been happening? I'm not so sure. But, a lot of what I was doing was treating policy as given and then seeing what's going to happen and interpreting what's happening in models based on optimal policy, not actual policies. Hubs and spokes, yes, of course. I'm not applied theorist, so I write models that are not fully realistic. Snakes, spiders. We have models of what I call snipers. I used to have pictures of that, but I think that would have been too much. But yes, of course, we can sort of put these things together. Shebnem, sorry. I guess you, maybe you felt that I was picking on you. I didn't mean to do that. I mean, of course, I take your point. Let me just push back, though, in the sense that, yes, it's not perfectly competitive model. Yes, you have monopolistic competition. But at the end of the day, this type of models, I think are great. We need, and I had it in the slides, and I didn't say it, which is it takes a model to beat a model. I don't have a model that beats your model. Okay, so it's a bit unfair what I'm doing. But all this smooth stuff that is in these frameworks, I increase there's some elasticity, and I move the tariff a little bit, and I put a 10% tariff, I move 10% of semiconductors to the US, 15% and this and that. That's not how I tend to think about how these things work. Because precisely this very small number of firms, there's big decisions, do I want to set up this plant or not? There's a lot of, the way that I view things is a lot of nonlinearities. And then there's very low elasticities. If you put this tariff, nothing moves, it's very low elasticity, but then you get to a point where someone moves everything, and then you have a massive elasticity. And I'm being vague because I don't have like a formal model to do that, but the work of Mark Mellett is a little bit along these lines. It's the EV market, there's not a lot of players, you have counterfactuals, and it starts moving like crazy when it wasn't moving for small tariffs. So that's the framework I have in mind, and I don't think it's about perfect competition or this and that. It's just these smooth models I'm a little bit skeptical about.
That's exactly why the model is not, that's the nonlinear, right? That's why in the internal applications, we are using exactly those EV tariffs and all those 2024 tariffs actually in the geopolitical. So that's what we do, and exactly to get at this micro literature, because you write down a macro model, even all the micro foundation and firm level decision making is there. There's going to be smooth. Stuff is going to be smooth, exactly. So then how do you kind of balance that is, when you go to data, you try to use as granular as you can the data, both on the linkage, you want to do from nothing, but also on the elasticity, so that and also over time. I mean, not only that certain assets are low, certain assets are high, they change over time, and that's what you get to dynamics where this exchange rate enters into the both pricing, marginal cost, and the market, right? And that is also going to change over time, and there you need also the financial player. When you say for 2,000 financial moves everything, the same thing on the financial market. It's less than that. 100 firms is going to move that exchange rate, and that's actually, what happens. If you look at it, there are working capital outflows from the U.S. There's a 10% dollar depreciation. How is that? Because like 50 guys are doing hedging at that, right?
So that's awesome. So that's awesome.
These things are going to be get into the
That's awesome. So then for
there is a model that smooths something.
so as a consumer, so if everything you're saying is right, so that's awesome. I would encourage you to kind of, like, obviously you want to come in and give some numbers, but give us like versions of the model that shut this down. And you're telling me the real model itself generates a lot of things that are not in standard models. So I'm really excited, and I'd like to see that.
And I fully agree. You can do the smoothing as little as you want. That's where the data is going to help you. You need data power, but you have to put this in a macro model. I mean, otherwise you are not going to go back to inflation output trade-off and all these policy questions. You have to put it in the macro model.
100% agree with that.
So, all right, I will step in here. We have an iron cage in there, and I have things. We'll put that on a YouTube. I would have Dick and then Tommaso, please, here.
Okay, so 3 questions.
Or maybe can we? I would like to cut a little bit of
3
room.
quick ones.
Very quick ones, then.
Very
please.
quick. So one's a data question, one's a technical question, the other's kind of a policy question. On the data, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, collects data on M&E sales, and that those data might, in the aggregate, give us more clues than looking at the data that exclude those. I think that's part of your point here. And if we include those, then we see that the role of U.S. firms is far greater than just, what they're exporting and so on. Second, related point to what Shebnem was talking about, and she and I discussed this earlier, the theory of effective protection was supposed to give us better measures of the effective tariff rate, including intermediate goods and so on. Notwithstanding your comment about Taiwan and, the numbers that came out of that, is that something that we ought to focus on for the purposes of discussing the real level of tariffs that are really affecting the economy in a broad sense? And the last point in the policy, you talked about a handful of firms, relatively speaking, affecting or being affected by shocks, and we have concentration of these firms. And you referred a little bit to the super firms. Well, a lot of these firms are in technology, and technology has enormous economies of scale. And I'm wondering that's also true for some other industries. And those firms are sort of the hyperscalers, the winners, and so on. Some of them are in services, some of them are in manufacturing. But the policy question is, given that concentration, does that mean that the impact of shocks is likely to be greater than it might otherwise be?
Tommaso?
Okay, so thanks, Paul. This was really fascinating, and also so I want to jump in this little exchange or really exchange. So I think correct me if I'm wrong. Well, one message that you're trying to send us here, among many, is well, if you look at global value chains, there is a lot of granularity in the sense of Acemoglu, Gabex, and so on, right? That looking at what happens to large multinationals that dominate these supply chains is very important. They dominate the value chains, they import, they export, and in a sense that should be modeled, okay? And we have models, on the data side, I think, and again, here I'm thinking of this inspiring Gabex paper on, instrumental granular data, right? That you can learn a lot about the aggregate effects if you look at shocks to single granular firms, right? And I think we probably the data problems that the Shebnem talk about, well, could be partly alleviated if we, try to look more, if we are interested in the aggregate effects of trade shocks or shocks to global value chains, let's look at these multinationals. Let's look at the data for those firms, because of what happens to those, even if there are tariffs on those firms only, we can extrapolate a lot of the aggregate implications, so in an instrumental variable sense.
Okay. Paul, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll be super brief.
That's okay. We still have a few minutes.
So on your questions, the first one, it's my failure. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to do. Okay, I had a table with multinationals in the U.S. and then showing you the sheer magnitude, and then I moved to another one where it was incorporating what they're doing abroad, which is exactly coming from the Bureau, the BEA data set, and showing you there's like another 75% of those coming from. So that paper is actually using both data sets. Effective rate of protection, of course, it's related. What's somewhat different, you may recall in that literature, the effective rates of protection tend to be much higher than nominal ones because input tariffs used to be much, much lower than downstream tariffs. Okay, that's the whole idea that we bring in the parts cheap and then we protect them and then we're giving them a bigger buffer stock. This is not where we are now. If you look at the Trump 1 tariffs, they fell disproportionately on inputs, not just steel, but other inputs rather than final goods. So if anything, that is not really giving you effective rates of protection in excess of the nominal ones. Economies of scale, yes, tech, but non-tech, semiconductors, an industry with massive scale economies. Okay, that generates concentration. Is that higher impact, lower impact? This is oligopoly. I have no idea. We're not there yet. I'm not there yet. It's a very interesting question. I don't have answers for that. And Tommaso, yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen applications, but yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, if that's what you have, you can use this feature shrewdly for identification purposes. But if folks are doing this, I'm not aware, but it's a good point.
Right, let me move around here. We have any questions over to the other room? Okay, I'm going to circle then across the radar. Anybody else? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
make the question quick, thanks. I was wondering if this global value chain sort of changes our understanding of gains from trade, in the sense that you've pinpointed like many new avenues of gains from trade, like complementarity, lower costs. But the idea that there's like a global value chain also makes me feel that sort of standard gains from trade are a little weaker. Like if you think about love of variety, will Boeing really love a variety of a Korean wing versus a Japanese wing? It's probably a little less true. Like based on these, like does the sort of aggregate gains from trade look larger, smaller, or is this an area for future research?
Yeah, no, I mean, typically gains from trade in these models tend to be larger. I mean, you don't need firms for that, but just sheer on input-output links. In models of snakes, for instance, with multiple stages, you could get much, much higher gains because the way I think about it is, relative to the world in which the cars were all produced locally, and now we have all these parts of the car that we can do anywhere. You're tapping on the comparative advantage of all these parts when before you kind of had to do everything at home. So, so in principle, and there's a work by Mallets and Writing that shows that in principle, the gains from trade could be unboundedly large if we had like unboundedly large value chains. In practice, quantitative models don't generate unbounded gains from trade because we're constrained by data. And in the data, the gross output to GDP ratio is about 2. In manufacturing, is like 2.5 to 3. It's not 80, which is what would come out of frameworks with many stages that are sort of traded. So short answer, yes, bigger gains, but don't think about it jacking up gains from trade by an order of 5 necessarily.
All right, I think we're at time, so please join me in thanking Paul for a stimulating lecture.
Thank you.
All right. We'll start right a new session right now. So.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So, I think we invite the new panelists to take over at this point. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to invite Jeffrey Frieden to present his paper, The Cost of Coercion.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's been a really fascinating conference so far. The blurb on this panel asked some really important questions. For example, how should policymakers approach the trade-off between insulation and diversification? Did trade policies go too far in the direction of diversification? Is the recent deglobalization trend correcting, or is it moving too far in the direction of resilience? And then Paul had some great questions, and I'm not going to answer any of them. I'm going to focus, because I am an academic, on a very narrow set of considerations about what we are now calling geoeconomics. What it implies and what it may mean from the standpoint of thinking about the economics of our societies and the politics of our societies, that economic policies are now being used very widely for non-economic means. So let's start by noting that all countries are not equal, as we have seen, that some countries are at the center or towards the center of a trading network. The US, and then if we were going to turn the globe around, you'd see China and Germany. You see there is very important in trade. The global financial network, as usually measured, has the US and the UK towards the center of them. And we know from life, as well as economics, that being central to a network among people and among countries provides a lot of power, often asymmetric power. In the international economic realm, it implies and has been used to interrupt or transform the way that trade is carried out, or to tax it, to change the ways capital flows move, the way capital moves around the world, to freeze assets and use them for a variety of purposes, perhaps. Economic power can be used. So the question I'm going to ask is, what's the counterpart? Life is full of trade-offs. Nothing comes easy. Nothing's free. And I want to ask us to consider what we are giving up when we think about using economic policy for non-economic purposes. The term that's generally been used, you've heard a bunch of it today, is geoeconomics, the use of economic tools for geopolitical purposes. And it is based on the the principle, on the observation, on the reality that governments that are important to trade and finance among nations can use that importance to extract concessions of an economic purpose, and that's typically picked up in things like trade policy bargaining, but also, and especially these days, concessions of a non-economic nature, like who is going to be your ally, how your allies are going to behave, how your enemies are going to behave, and things along those lines. I'm sure you all know that geoeconomics is not new. Countries have used their bargaining power their economic bargaining power for non-economic means as long as there have been countries, really. Back in the days of mercantilism in the 16th through 19th century, one of the great theorists of mercantilism, Thomas Hobbes, is famously quoted as having said, "Wealth is power, and power is wealth." And that was the basic principle of a lot of international economic and foreign policy in the mercantilist era, which was an era dominated by colonial monopolies, whose monopolies were enforced by military force. The military force reinforced the monopolies provided tribute, which allowed for the military force to be supplied, and so mercantilism was a system that was based on the use of military power for economic means and economic policy for military means. That then gave way to the first era of globalization, and we can remember that Adam Smith and David Ricardo trained their guns, their analytical guns, and their political lobbying guns against the mercantilist controls in the interest of comparative advantage, and that not only the intellectual side, but also the real political and political economy side led to that first era of globalization from the 19th into the early 20th century. The interwar period is one which, unfortunately, as we all know, led to a lot of geoeconomics, which is one of the things that Albert Hirschman's classic book that was referred to, I think, by Sednem before spoke about, and that use of geoeconomics for military purposes was reinforced when the Cold War hit after World War II. We had 75 good years, I guess, in which geoeconomic principles mattered primarily in the Cold War sense, but it has returned. Whether in the case of U.S.-Russian relations or in the case of U.S.-Chinese relations, the use of sanctions, and this is only the sanctions data, the use of sanctions has increased very dramatically in the past 15 years and even more dramatically in the past 5. So let me make a few preliminary observations before I go into thinking about these things. The first is to note, as Sednem and others have noted, that there are two kinds of countries that can engage in geoeconomics. One is what you might think of as normal countries, or maybe we might say the small open economy, whatever the small open economy version of sanctions or geoeconomics is, countries whose behavior affects their partners but does not affect the entire world. And then the major powers, whose policies can have systemic effects on affecting the organization of the international economic and political order by their behavior. And there are also two kinds of sanctions to note. The one kind of sanction is a sanction or a geoeconomic policy that is intended as a bargaining chip. Right? And what that means is that if it's a bargaining chip, you're going to take it off after the bargain is struck. I would note that some of the current policies of the current administration are contradictory because some people want to use these tariffs as bargaining chips and other people want to use them to protect domestic industry, and you can't do both at the same time because if you're protecting domestic industry, then the commitment to take them off is not credible. Another kind of sanction, however, is one that's meant to punish, like the embargo on, or the attempted embargo on oil in the Soviet Union, in Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, intended to be maybe semi-permanent. They may not be as different as they appear, however, because at some level the embargo on Russia was intended to change Russian behavior, and it was understood that if it was credible, and if the Russians responded in kind or as desired, those sanctions would be removed. But it is important to recognize that policymakers may be thinking differently about different kinds of sanctions. A couple of other preliminary observations. The first is sanctions have been studied for many, many years. It is very, very difficult to figure out whether sanctions are successful, for the very simple reason that the ones that are most successful are ones that are never imposed, because they are so damaging, so potentially damaging, that they have their effect without having to be imposed. The observed sanctions are, in some sense, out of equilibrium behavior. They're imposed because the threat of their being imposed hasn't worked, and so at some level they've already failed. But there is evidence by some good studies that sanctions do have some success, and of course they wouldn't be used if they didn't have at least some chance of succeeding. The second thing that I'm going to mention as a preliminary observation, which is important because it's going to structure most of the rest of my talk, is that sanctions are imposed because they're expected to provide some benefit to the country that's imposing them. Geoeconomic policy is about costs and benefits. But the benefits are very hard to assess in any kind of rigorous or certainly pecuniary way, because how much do we value national security? We can perhaps value the cost of the sanctions that we impose, but it's hard to know how much we value the benefits that accrue to us if those benefits are non-pecuniary, if they're about national security, if they're about alliance behavior, if they're about deterrence. And I just want to make clear that I'm going to focus on the costs of these geoeconomic policies without in any way denying that there may be important benefits. And I'm not arguing that these policies are wrong or are not justifiable, but I am arguing, I guess, would argue pretty strongly that whatever you think about them, it's important to know their costs. Okay? So, when we think about what could go wrong, in my mind at least, what I think could go wrong, thinking about the cost or the opportunity cost of geoeconomic policies, is that it foregoes opportunities. There are opportunities lost when we impose policies that restrict the economic activity that our citizens, that our firms can engage in. And at the biggest level, just to point out that in some sense, this is the mirror image of the gains from international cooperation. Right? When countries cooperate, they surrender some sovereignty in order to undertake policies that they would not otherwise undertake. What geoeconomics does is it use the sovereign rights of nation states to engage in non-cooperative behavior. So this is explicitly saying we are a sovereign state. We know that we could gain from cooperation. We know that there are economic opportunities that we would benefit from if we were to give up some of our sovereignty. But in this particular instance, we're going to insist on our right to impose policies that reduce the level of cooperation, that reduce the gains that we might gain from cooperating with others. Let me also point out that coercion, that the use of geoeconomic policies, changes expectations of behavior. That when countries cooperate, we were talking a little bit about this at lunch, when countries or people cooperate, there are expectations of behavior. And once expectations change, it's very difficult to change back. So undertaking policies along the geoeconomic continuum at some level may lead to changes in the reputation, the expectations of behavior of other countries about our government's reliability and credibility. And of course, credibility and reliability have value of their own. So, what kinds of opportunities are lost? The most obvious one is aggregate economic efficiency. Clearly, by restricting economic exchange in any way, we're pulling the economy, presumably pulling it away from comparative advantage. And despite Paul's discussion, I still believe in comparative advantage, at least at some level, and I'm sure Paul does too. So the restricting economic exchange does imply, almost by definition, that we are not carrying out the policies that would maximize aggregate social welfare, aggregate economic welfare. I guess you can't say aggregate social welfare because presumably these non-economic goals enter into social welfare, but aggregate economic welfare is not maximized when we limit it for geoeconomic purposes. And there's, I think, an important implication of this, which I think is pretty closely related to some of the exchange that was you guys engaged in before, that it's an opportunity for specialization in particular that is lost. Specialization, we all know, is crucial to productivity and productivity growth. The modern international economy and modern international trade, as we have just heard, is founded upon a very high degree of specialization among countries, among firms, even within firms, because it's so profitable and so productive in an open world economy. But that specialization that is extremely profitable, valuable both to the firms and to the countries in question, is also the source of great vulnerability. So there is a very explicit trade-off here between the gains from specialization and the costs of vulnerability. And I have a couple of examples, one of which is almost identical to the one that Paul put up there. The iPhone 4, the modern supply chains are extraordinarily complex, right? For high value-added and very profitable products. Not T-shirts, you know, most of those links can be replaced very easily, but most of the products that we value most of the products that are central to our economic activity and to our consumption, most of the products where most of the profit is being made by our firms and our people, have links that are very difficult to replace and therefore very vulnerable. And you know, I won't even talk about this because Paul put a very similar picture up there. This is very, very profitable every step of the way and also very vulnerable. So specialization central to the modern international economy, the global value chains that Paul has just talked about and that Sednam has also worked on so well, it is central to the way our economies are organized. It also makes them vulnerable and also allows us to exploit their vulnerability, but at the cost of the benefits of specialization. Other opportunities, innovation. Sanctions, in some sense, reduce the effective size of the market, and innovative activity is encouraged by a wider market, discouraged by restricting the market. The targets also are encouraged to innovate themselves when they're excluded from the market. The Hirschman himself, I think, pointed out that the Nazis invented polyurethane when they were cut off from supplies of rubber and invented methadone when they were cut off from supplies of morphine. So substitutability is on a continuum, and innovative activity can be spurred, as I think we have found in the last few years with respect to U.S.-China relations, by using sanctions to cut targets off from our goods, especially our high technology goods. There is empirical evidence that I referred to here that U.S. export controls both reduce R&D activity at home and increase R&D activity abroad, especially among the target nations. So innovation may suffer as a result of some of these geoeconomic policies. Opportunities are lost also for a country's reputation. We've said, you know, it takes 50 years to build up a reputation and 5 weeks to destroy it. A reputation is valuable in a financial context. It can raise a country's borrowing costs and discourage long-term partnerships. Coercion that is imposed for short-term purposes by affecting a country's reputation for reliability and stability can lead to long-term decoupling. So you pursue a short-term goal and may realize that short-term goal, but it can have substantial long-term negative effects. Partners may be driven, and here I'm thinking partners not only targets but also allies, as Paul pointed out, may be driven to seek financial and technological autonomy. There is evidence that U.S. sanctions and the continued use of U.S. financial sanctions have reduced the use of the dollar in reserves, only slightly, but these things happen over a long period of time. In more recent events, we've seen that American trade policies to try to achieve non-economic goals with respect to Brazil and India have been associated with the reorientation of those two countries' trade away from the U.S. and towards China. And I think of the broader institutional example of the American decision not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2016. The other countries that were in that TPP didn't decide that it was a bad idea just because the U.S. wasn't going to join. They decided it was a perfectly good idea, and we now have the progressive and comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, an association organization that was originally designed by the U.S. to isolate China. Now, since China is trying to join the progressive and comprehensive TPP, looks like it may become an organization that will isolate the U.S. from countries that did create the TPP. So, in some sense, there is the concern that in the attempt to achieve short-term geopolitical goals, a country may be trading off longer-term economic activity and economic goals. So these are, another thing I want to point out is that we have been typically talking about countries as applying these policies and countries as realizing the benefits and the costs. But the reality is all politics is local in some sense, and that what a country does in its geopolitical realm, what it does in its economic policy, has distributional effects. That distributional effects have an impact on the policies that are pursued, and the policies pursued have a distributional impact themselves. So some of the geoeconomic policies we talk about have benefits for particular groups. If we think of imposing sanctions in order to achieve market access or regulatory forbearance for big American firms, you're asking the American public to bear costs that are then realized as concentrated benefits. By the same token, often geoeconomic policies that have a broad impact on national security are imposing concentrated costs, say on farmers or on firms that are restricted from having access to particular markets. Those are all likely to be politically controversial, and to the extent that geoeconomic tools are, for example, used to extract benefits on behalf of some concentrated industries or some concentrated groups, tech firms, exporters, pharma, the aggregate economy bears the costs, that's likely to be politically and economically controversial. If the country needs to impose sanctions but their costs are borne by particular groups in society, that's likely to be controversial as well. So that's sort of my summary of some of the costs when we think of small open economies, I suppose, or small open political economies, dealing with policies that any country could use in their relations with neighbors. Let me turn now to geoeconomics for major powers. The great powers have, from time immemorial, shaped global economic and political order. And in the literature on hegemony, which is a term that I thought I would never hear again because it sort of fell out of favor among political scientists, but it now seems to be in favor among economists, so maybe we'll come back to using it. In the literature on hegemony, early on, people made a distinction between benevolent and coercive hegemony. And coercive hegemony is you use your great power in order to extract resources from the rest of the world, in a purely extractive sense, in a sort of transactionally extractive sense. But there's a problem with that, which is that an uncooperative, disorganized, disunited, not an integrated international economy has costs even for the great power, right? And so you could imagine a hegemonic power deciding that it is in its own interest to act as a provider of global public goods, guaranteeing contracting across borders, providing monetary and financial stability, and encouraging cooperative behavior among the countries of the world. And that is the 1971 Kindleberger book. Just to point out that Kindleberger in 1971 wrote, this was a conclusion, like 5-page conclusion to his monumental survey of the Great Depression. So he goes through the very detailed discussion of the Great Depression and ends up by saying, what do we see by this? What we see is it takes a country to stabilize the international economy. Now, some people would say maybe it could be 2 or 3 countries cooperating, but a country to stabilize the international economy. The world economy is not self-equilibrating. It requires cooperation. It requires global public goods that are not simply provided by markets. And that was true under the hegemony of Great Britain, and that has been true, he said in 1971, under the hegemony of the U.S. And the problem with the interwar period is that the mantle of hegemony was offered to the U.S. and declined. And that, in his view, and in the view of many since him, was at the root of the problems of the interwar period. So that's the essential line here that a number of us have been talking about, and this is simply some graphical representation of what the world has looked like, both in financial and in trade terms, with and without hegemony, right? So great powers do shape global order, whether they do it in a coercive or a cooperative way. There are major externalities from their individually oriented behavior. British and American hegemony are examples, providing global public goods and enforcing them. And they have a systemic impact. I'll come back to what I said before. policies on the part of a hegemon establish expectations of behavior. A lot of talk about a rules-based international economic order, but as I was saying to some others, what does it mean to have a rules-based order when there's no global government and no global policeman? There's no one there to enforce the rules. What really we mean by this is that the U.S. and its partners established expectations of behavior that led to cooperative outcomes among the nations of the world. And so there is a systemic impact by the behavior of the great powers that can either encourage globalization Mark I or globalization Mark II, or, in its absence, encourage fragmentation and the development of regional blocs. So opportunities lost here for world order. Geoeconomic coercion, I think, weakens multilateralism. It leads to less trust among nations, therefore less trade, less cooperation, less capital flow, fewer capital flows. And the isolation of the 1930s in the United States, I think, deepened the Great Depression. This is relevant, I think, because the post-war international economic order and political order has been based quite clearly on American leadership. American leadership in its own self-interest. There was never any question, at least until recently, in the 1950s and 60s, that the U.S. was leading the world in a direction that was both in its interest and good for most of the rest of the world. The second pillar was multilateralism. Multilateralism I think of as being a guarantee that the U.S. would not misuse its leadership to exploit its partners. In a sense, it was a way of satisfying the participation constraint. You can't get people to go along with American leadership if they don't have at least some voice in how that leadership is going to be exercised. Both of these things are now in question in the current administration, which believes that the U.S. has been overburdened and overstretched and is no longer in a position to be a world leader, and that multilateralism does not serve America's interests. So, some implications maybe for policy, I don't know. I'm not arguing that the net costs are negative. In fact, I think governments are usually rational within their own constraints, whatever their preferences may be, and that rational governments would try to ensure that the net benefits are always positive. And there's probably a consensus that some of these geoeconomic policies are pretty much always valid, like blockading Nazi Germany or imposing COCOM during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But I think it's very important, as we move into a world in which geoeconomics will become the norm, I think, to weigh both the benefits, the potential benefits, and the costs, especially to keep in mind that what look like short-term benefits may turn out to be long-term costs, that what gains short-term advantage may be a long-term reputational disadvantage. It's important to align the coercive tools with broader geopolitical goals. And if you happen to be a great power, not you, if a country happens to be a great power, to consider the systemic impact of coercion on much broader factors like the openness of the world economy, on globalization, on cooperation among nations. So economic coercion has real and measurable costs. The benefits may justify its use, but they do require transparent evaluation. And I think that we have had far too little far too little promotion of the benefits and far too little discussion of the costs. A wise use of geoeconomics, it balances the two, and at the global level, it concerns me that there is too little attention paid, not in this room, of course, but elsewhere, to the ways in which geoeconomics can either reinforce cooperation for global stability or undermine it. Thank you.
Thank you. Lana Mosley will now give the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff, for your paper and your presentation, and thank you for inviting me. I want to start with my comments are going to do some to kind of reinforce some of the points that Jeff has just mentioned, and then maybe raise some additional questions. And I want to start with just a few general observations and then talk a little bit about sensitivity versus vulnerability. And then I'll say a few things about policy instruments, kind of in the spirit of thinking again about cost and benefits. So one thing to keep in mind is that we know there are long-standing connections between geopolitical or security considerations and foreign economic policies. So Jeff mentioned the era of mercantilism. We could think about governments using their military power to extract raw materials and other things. We know that governments have often limited exchange with their strategic rivals. We can also think about the other side of this long-running claim that trade and financial integration can be used to help dampen conflict. And so we can go back, in the spirit of thinking about people who wrote a long time ago, we can go back to Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, talking about the spirit of commerce as something that would promote his so-called perpetual peace. Or we can think about the founding of the European Union and the sort of early discussions around the European coal and steel community in the 1950s, invoking this being a good thing to do from the point of view of preventing Franco-German conflict. And you heard that same kind of logic from people like Helmut Kohl in the 1990s in moving to the single currency and European monetary union. So this idea that economics and sort of military and strategic considerations intersect is long running. It's also the case that even at the height of the late 20th and early 21st century globalization that we kind of try to look back fondly on sometimes, and at the height of a kind of rules-based liberal international order, geopolitics mattered. So we know that countries were more likely, all else equal, to conclude preferential trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties with their allies. We know that governments' allocation of foreign aid was not simply about development goals, but instead it was about their own strategic interest in recipient countries. And we know that when we think about how the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank operated in terms of their lending programs or their enforcing of conditionalities, this reflected, not entirely, but certainly at the margins, the commercial as well as strategic interest of powerful member countries. Geopolitical weight gave powerful countries influence in the rules-based international order. And as Jeff alluded to, it also generated resentment. So we know that frustration sometimes motivated other countries to seek alternatives. So countries thinking about opening up swap lines with China or getting financing from Chinese-based entities were partly doing so out of a frustration or a sense that the U.S. had been kind of throwing its weight around in the IMF and elsewhere. The second sort of thing I think that to keep in mind is that Jeff's paper is very much focused on a country that is central to a commercial or financial network and thinking about whether it should use that centrality to coerce others in service of its geopolitical aims, and whether or not that's a good idea in a cost and benefit sense. And he points out that coercion could be effective in the short run, but again, it might also set off a search for alternatives. So you mentioned currency reserves, and if you look at the data in terms of central bank holding of reserve currencies, there's long been talk that the dollar's global role was under threat. It was going to diminish. First, it was because of the euro. More recently, sort of other things that might harm its dominant position. If you look at the data, you see that over time, indeed, central bank holdings of dollars have gone down. The dollar still dominates. And so there is this kind of idea that, well, yeah, the issue is there's no alternative, right? Even if there is demand for dollar alternatives, there's not much in the way of supply. But it could be that longer term, right, the use of by the U.S. of its leverage in terms of being able to impose financial sanctions might accelerate this search for alternatives. So the idea there is Jeff's point that in the short run, coercion could be effective. In the medium to long run, it could undermine your ability to coerce into the future. But what I want to sort of focus on for a little bit is the fact that if a country is less central, or if a country is kind of on the receiving end, that is, if they are not the sender of coercion, but potentially the target, there's maybe a different question that's there. And the reason I want to talk about this is that, I read the paragraph description of the session, and I thought maybe I should, Jeff didn't want to try, I thought I should try to link into that just a tiny little bit. But more important, that so much of the conversation in the U.S. now is really, I think, about vulnerabilities around rare earths or antibiotics or semiconductors, and it's really about other countries might have leverage over us, and what should we be doing? And I know that's also, of course, going to be, I'm guessing, the focus of the industrial policy session that's on tomorrow. So in thinking about countries that are exposed to these kinds of pressures, we then hear a lot of talk about de-risking, resilience, decoupling, friendshoring, right, all the kind of current buzzwords. And again, in the spirit of going back to things written a long time ago, it might be useful to keep in mind the distinction that is drawn by Robert Cohen and Joe Nye in a book that was published in 1977 called Power and Interdependence. I did not take a picture of my own book. Okay, I did not steal this from a library. This is on the internet. Okay, and you may know that Joe Nye passed away a few months ago. You also might know, if you're a complete geek, that the next book that Robert Cohen wrote was called After Hegemony. So we're bringing that back as well. But in this book, Cohen and I talk about the distinction between sensitivity and vulnerability interdependence. Right, sensitivity being something that results very typically from economic integration. By being more integrated in terms of trade or in terms of supply chains or in terms of finance, you are exposed, you, maybe the individual worker, the firm, and the country, to both negative and positive shocks emanating from the rest of the world. This often has very little relationship with national security or geopolitical concerns. You can be sensitive and yet not be vulnerable. Now, it doesn't mean, in the kind of broader political environment, that sensitivity isn't risky from the point of view of governments when governments are thinking about their political survival in office. If your economy is quite sensitive, it means that external shocks have distributional consequences, right? And so if we think about the political response to the China shock, or we think about the demands for compensation that those who lose out when trade integration picks up, right, you can see that sensitivity can play a role. But with respect to thinking more about security and geopolitics, we're much more kind of in that world of vulnerability, where the key concern is about whether or not there are alternatives, how costly it is to find those alternatives, and about being subject to hold-up problems. And so again, we see lots of discussion then in terms of payment systems, semiconductors, antibiotics, quantum technologies, rare earths, and these sorts of things. And it might be that vulnerability becomes especially concerning in the context of power transitions. So Jeff had this graph about, these eras of hegemony, British and then American, and that time in between where we see both trade and financial openness decline. These are kind of, in some ways, kind of power transition points, right? And the other concern then is that some rising power, okay, who also can exploit your vulnerability is going to be real trouble. And of course, we all know that there's a particular country that we're worried about in that context. And so then we get to, okay, if you are vulnerable, how do you reduce exposure? Jeff mentioned that coercion has a kind of uncertain benefits. It's really hard to measure these things. It's hard to know, from the point of view of a government, how much value that autonomy that you might buy is going to have in the future. It's also, of course, hard to know what other countries are going to do to adapt, right? This is a sort of dynamic situation. And so I think it's maybe, it's difficult, of course, to measure these benefits. It might, of course, also be somewhat difficult empirically to measure some of the costs that Jeff has described. So I think it's worth thinking then about, if you're in a world where you're vulnerable and you're thinking about what to do, there are probably different instruments available to address vulnerability. So Jeff really focused on trade and or financial sanctions. He talked a bit about tariffs as well. We could think about a broader set of instruments, which sometimes are not necessarily punishments, but are instead inducements, right? So we could think about the world of carrots versus sticks. But I think more generally, when countries are facing these kinds of issues, they might do a variety of things. So if you take data from the Global Trade Alert and you look at sort of restrictive measures that governments are imposing, this is governments worldwide. One thing that's very striking here, of course, is that you see these restrictive measures being used much more frequently since the pandemic. You also will see, you might not be able to see, but I can see, that subsidies play a big role here in terms of these measures, as do then import restrictions, export promotion, export restrictions, investment screening, investment restrictions. Governments are thinking about this with different policy instruments. There was a report out last week, I think it was, from the Council on Foreign Relations talking about U.S. economic security, and again, sort of going through the different kinds of instruments that are being used, right? And again, industrial policy features here, so does investment screening. It's not only about sanctions or tariffs or export controls. And so I think from the point of view of academic research, but also academic research that sort of matters for policymaking, we might want to think about how governments evaluate the choices among these different instruments. So one concern that Jeff mentioned, one potential cost, is that there's a worry about domestic political capture, right? When governments are using their position for coercion, there are going to be groups or firms within the country that benefit specifically from that. And so we might think about, are these different instruments more or less prone to that kind of political capture, right? To what extent will there be accusations of veiled protectionism leveled more against some instruments than against others? This might relate as well to sort of how transparent the use of the instrument is. When things are more opaque, then we could sort of imagine obfuscation being used again for domestic political reasons. We might also ask whether or not, to the extent that sort of public opinion matters over these kinds of issues, whether mass publics are more willing to support and to bear the cost of certain instruments, and I think also of instruments aimed at certain targets. I think people who study the public opinion of trade, and I'm including political scientists as well as economists in this, we want to think that people's views about trade are material in nature in some way or another. It's about their own job, their own industry, it's about their broader community. Whether it's egotropic or sociotropic, we want to think it's all materially based. But I think we have some evidence that it's not only about sort of material effects, it's also about what we might think about as culture, cosmopolitanism, or sort of less nicely, racism. Third, we want to ask whether certain ones of these instruments are going to be more or less likely to damage international reputation. So this goes back to Jeff's point about coercion damaging your reputation. We might think about whether some policy instruments which help to address vulnerability are sort of easier to govern in some kind of rules-based framework, right, where we could sort of have an international means governing the use of something like, for instance, investment screening. Okay, the last thing I want to mention then is to think about the potential longer-term risk of de-risking and decoupling. So I talked about early on about the commercial piece and sort of Kant and others' idea. And we could think about this as being the result of domestic incentives to solve disputes peacefully. Countries always have conflicts of interest. The question is, can they reach a solution short of direct sort of military conflict? And the notion was that when there are lots of groups in society that are gaining from international trade and finance, those groups might push their governments to kind of find these non-military solutions to conflicts of interest. Economic integration, connections between economies, facilitated bargaining between countries. Interdependence meant that if you had a conflict about some non-economic issue, you might be able to offer trade or investment kinds of concessions to help solve that conflict of interest. So this is this idea of issue linkage and linking together economic and non-economic issues, right? Issue linkage to be effective requires that countries are connected across multiple dimensions. If we move to a world of decoupling, or at least some de-risking, we're going to have economies that are actually less connected. And they're going to be less able to use economic relations to make concessions. And so in this strange way, it may be that a world of decoupling actually gets riskier in terms of governments having more difficulty solving their conflicts of interest in ways that don't involve the use of military force. And on that happy note, I'm done.
Thank you. So we can start with Jeff's response before going to the Q&A.
I don't think there's anything I disagree with, Lena. So that makes my task difficult. I think one thing to point out is that when you're talking about power transitions, or however we want to think of it, there are a whole series of threats there. One threat, I mean, the underlying threat is we don't know the true intentions of the rising power. And so that means, in a sense, what are the real options you can undertake from an insurance kind of standpoint to protect yourself against a rising power? Is the behavior of should you engage in behavior to try to encourage cooperation from the rising power and hope that one assumes that we might think back on this as what the British thought they were doing with the U.S., but then the U.S. didn't cooperate in 1920. So do you try to encourage cooperation from the rising power on the expectation that the behavior will be reciprocated, or do you expect that the rising power is going to be coercive, predatory, whatever you want to think of it, trying to displace you? And since we're really talking about equilibria here, you can easily fall off from one to another. And so the danger of that power transition period is precisely that the behavior, the expected behavior of the two principal parties, let's assume there's one hegemon and one rising, are unknown. And as a result, you can go very easily off a cliff, if you will, in a very bad direction, or alternately perhaps go in an upward direction. As I suppose the positive example would be 1943-44 at Bretton Woods, where the U.S. and the U.K. cooperate on what the post-war world is going to look like. So I think that in some sense, lurking behind a lot of what you and I have been talking about is precisely this question. What are the true intentions of both parties? I mean, many of us have questions about what the true intentions of the Trump administration are in this regard, or how we should think about American foreign economic or foreign policy more broadly in this context. I have my views and others have others, but I'm not in charge of any country's foreign policy, so it's not very important. But those who are making decisions that are going to have very long-term implications for the rest of the world based on very uncertain expectations about the behavior of the major powers. No, I agree with everything you said, and therefore I have very little to say in response.
And this is being recorded, so...
So now that's right. You can quote me.
Okay, so we will now go to Q&A. I would ask you to wait for the mic before you speak, and then when you do speak, to please introduce yourself with your name. Yes, let's start with David Weinstein.
Is it on? Yeah. I thought there was a great presentation and discussion, so I really felt I learned a lot. I've got a question. Kind of having sat through a lot of economics conferences and papers where people told us about an equilibrium in which you had the WTO and a rules-based system, and what we seem to have observed is a shift in the political order from something, what Gary Gerstle would call the neoliberal order, in which there was a rules-based system and that was seen as an equilibrium, and we had figured things out, to basically, starting with Trump, but really continuing with Biden, who didn't roll back any of the tariffs, to a new equilibrium in which both parties in the United States are protectionist. And I guess the question I have as a social scientist, and I'm not a political scientist, so that's why I'm asking you, is what changed? Why did that happen? Right? What was why, around the time of Trump, did both parties come around to feel like, we have to fundamentally, go against the WTO and move to a system in which we're doing geoeconomics? And maybe this is the time, maybe this period, which now needs a new name, is the geoeconomic world order. But how do you see that change or why do you see that change is happening?
That's a big question.
Yes, here, you can answer.
Okay. So I think I would think of two approaches, one of which I'll state and the other which I believe. The one that I would state, it's not that I don't believe both of them. One is the rise of China, right? So the rise of China leads to challenges to American leadership, challenges to the way in which the U.S. has acted within the international economic order, especially because, for one thing, it gives countries an alternative, which gives them greater bargaining power vis-a-vis the U.S., and then raises questions about alternate spheres of influence that might threaten the U.S. in one way or another. I think that's important. But I think I would insist on not an alternative, but another component part of this. And let me start, at the expense of rattling on, with a historical analogy. Why did the classical gold standard era that lasted from the 1840s or 50s until World War I collapse? It wasn't really the rise of the U.S. The U.S. was not opposed. I mean, it didn't participate after World War I. It was the major powers and the countries that had been central to that gold standard free trade era attempted to restore it in the 1920s and failed miserably over and over again. And not for international geopolitical reasons, but for domestic political reasons. The underlying demands of the gold standard system were inconsistent with what were now democratic systems with organized labor and democratic political parties and contestation, and the kinds of adjustment burdens that had been imposed on countries during the gold standard were politically unacceptable. And that's an analogy, and the analogy, what I would draw it to is, I think, globalization as it evolved after 2000, and especially after the great financial crisis, 2007 through 9, led to a series of distributional effects in the major countries of the world, and especially in the U.S., that were politically unacceptable to large portions of the population. And, you know, if you want to be simple-minded about it, globalization was mismanaged, or it was managed in ways that were not acceptable to very large portions of our populations. And so I have in the back of my mind, if I ever have time, writing a paper whose title, now I can't use it, I guess someone will steal it, is the domestic roots of international economic disorder, in parentheses, order. Because I think that obviously the geopolitical relation between the U.S. and China is crucial, but I think the domestic politics of the backlash against globalization, whether from Brexit to the rise of populism to the rise of populism in the U.S., are absolutely essential. That without that, we wouldn't have had American isolationism in the interwar period. That was a purely domestic factor. Without that, we wouldn't have had the collapse of the gold standard or the difficulties in restoring it. And frankly, I think without that, we would not be where we are today.
Sorry, Richard Brenner.
A couple quick questions related to what you just said. We all face globally existential threats from a variety of sources, climate being maybe at the top of the list, depending on how you look at it. But clearly, those global threats are collective action, create collective action problems. So I'm wondering, in this context, what do you see as the solution to cooperation or to get a halfway house so that we can deal with some of these problems? Second related question, which you just referred to, is in a domestic context, we have division that, I certainly haven't seen much of in my lifetime within our borders. And so what do you think might be the solution to coming together a little bit on that score?
Two easy questions there, right? So how do we save the world and how do we save our country? Well, collective action problems are rife in international politics. There isn't one way of solving them, and we've had a very institutionalized system since World War II, but that's relatively new. Hegemony is not the only way to provide global public goods, and frankly, if you want to think about alternatives, a system of blocks in which there are, club goods being provided within the block in question might do the trick. And maybe it's better to accept that countries are only willing to cooperate within their region or with countries that are like-minded in one way or another than to assume that everybody can cooperate on everything all the time. So an alternative might be something along the line of regional blocks or even substantive cooperation on different issues. I mean, some of the very earliest cooperative measures that were achieved back 150 years ago were things like public health, because bacteria don't know where the borders are, and telecommunications are really postal communications. And so there may be things on which people can agree, even though they disagree on almost everything else. And the U.S. and the Soviet Union cooperated on a lot, but not on economics and military. But so that's one thing. On the domestic context, if I had a solution, believe me, I would tell you. I do think that there is evidence, and I and many others have worked on this, that although it may be too late in some fundamental sense, that compensatory measures to deal with some of the distributional effects that have led to these conflicts are relatively effective. And I know that there are many who have thought about the kinds of place-based policies that might address the distressed regions of the country or of our country. I mean, populism is a regional phenomenon. It is highly regionally concentrated in distressed regions. Regions that were, to use the common term, left behind. And so maybe one step in that direction is recognizing that explicitly instead of, going to be very nasty here, instead of dressing it up as the green transition, but recognize that explicitly as a way of addressing the legitimate concerns of people whose regions have been suffering for decades, and maybe that might help. But that's just my particular obsession these days.
We had a question over here. Yes. Sorry, in the blue.
Okay, in back.
Takes a while. Okay, there you go. So yeah, a quick one. So a good example, I think, of a country that's been on the receiving end of this year's Canada, and I was reading that they're purchasing their first nuclear submarines in decades and deciding between Korea and Germany, and these are very long-term processes between the manufacturer, the delivery, the service, the maintenance. And so from the perspective of the U.S., let's just say it's a long-term cost for our defense industry. How quickly could this be reversed? So 2028 comes around, new administration comes in, says, sorry, didn't mean it. Can we go back to how we were? But, realistically, how quickly could one undo some of what's, happening at the moment?
I mean, you heard a lot of this after 2017 or 2020 on the expectation that the new administration would simply reverse everything. But, choose your cliche. You can't put the chicken back in the egg, whatever it may be. There have been fundamental changes in domestic politics in the U.S. and in world politics. And once you change people's expectations about the reliability of American commitments, very, very difficult to unchange them. So, yes, we could move back towards something different. I don't think we're ever going back to pre-2015 or 27 conditions. But I think, yes, belying my actual personal beliefs, yes, I think things could be better and we could move away from the brink, but I don't think we're not going to go back to where we were 20 years ago. There are plenty of opportunities to do that, and maybe, depending on what happens over the next year or so, maybe this administration or subsequent administrations will reconsider some of these measures. But I think to a certain extent, even with Canadians, not maybe especially with Canadians, expectations, reputations have been fundamentally transformed. That can't be changed immediately.
Karsten.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation and the discussion. It's very interesting. I have a couple of comments, and these are hardline economics, a hardline economics perspective. So, with apologies. Suppose we start off with national income maximization, an old workhorse in economics. There is a deep incentive for nations to seek access to other countries, to other markets. And that's actually regardless of the size of these countries. But let me emphasize, in particular, relatively small countries may actually want to get access at a lot of places at the same time. It will allow them to specialize even more, and then they can sort of go into many markets and sell their Legos or whatever it is they're up to. So I think that's important in understanding the evolving world around us. I think that that ties in fact, to the point you're making, Jeff, about coercion. Coercion or not coercion, countries would actually want to do that. That process would be going on, even if the hegemon of the large country is relatively friendly. This idea of access, it was actually one of the beauties of the GATT, that once you became a member of GATT, you actually became a member of a very large family. You got access to everyone who was already there. So that provided a deep incentive for many countries to engage, even though they undertook very large shocks. Final remark, when we talk about vulnerability and sensitivities, there is sort of a hidden or not even hidden assumption here that these are shocks abroad. But when we're looking at the world, a lot of nations, and I think you hinted at this now in your most latest comments, you can actually, do you want to rely on your own field, your little farmer wherever, or would you, what's a way to reduce that risk? Perhaps access to markets. Thank you.
I've spent decades trying to convince undergraduates at UCLA, Harvard, and Columbia, my three perches, of comparative advantage, including economics undergraduates, with great difficulty. It doesn't seem intuitive, even though specialization does seem intuitive. And more to the point, so I don't think that it's ideas that are the barrier. There is a sort of a folk wisdom. If you look at the polls, Americans today say trade is good for the country, but it's bad for jobs, which I think of as a sort of folk economics, because they're not wrong, because they're thinking of the jobs they know, the jobs that exist. And so we can tell them, you don't understand, for every job that's saved by trade protection, you're losing two and in export industry. And the fact is, or for liberalization is going to create jobs in export industries, but those aren't jobs that they know about, and the people that might hold those jobs don't know that they're going to hold them. So jobs and expectation are outweighed by jobs lost in reality. Another way of thinking of it is the benefits of economic integration are countrywide and diffuse. There are some concentrated benefits. Many of the costs are very concentrated on firms, on industries, and on regions. And, one of the commonplaces of political economy is that concentrated interests beat diffuse interests every time. So I don't disagree with anything you said, but it hasn't been a convincing argument politically for hundreds of years. So we can keep trying, but I think in the real world of politics, we face an uphill battle in making arguments about aggregate social welfare, which, after all, doesn't vote. People vote, not aggregate economic welfare. Obviously, it's internalized in various ways, but again, I'd go back to concentrated costs are much more visible, much more politically powerful than concentrated effects are much more powerful than the diffuse ones.
We have time for one more question, Egon.
I was struck, Alina, by your last slide there. It was a bit of a pessimistic, but it struck me as just two data points. If I think of historically the end of globalization, the first wave, the end of Pax Britannica, that was a very integrated world in terms of financial and global things. You had a hegemon, Great Britain, but it was being challenged. It was being challenged by the Imperial Germany, right? And it did not end that well. We're now, Pax America, it's going to end. American hegemon is being challenged by rising China. Do you see any parallels in that? Could this, do you want to comment on that? But it's just, I know it's two data points, but as a policy economist, I can run a regression and it fits pretty well.
That's political science, two data
sorry.
points.
No, I would just go back to actually to Jeff's observation about, you know, that at the point of power transition, right, governments are making assumptions about their counterparts and whether their intentions are malign or benign and what they should do. You know, when I used to teach Intro to International Politics, we would spend a long time talking about the causes of war. And I would talk about the causes of World War I versus World War II and why it was different. And, you know, one of the stories about the First World War was about kind of domestic politics in Germany and the kind of cult of the military offensive. But the other sort of part of the story was about this kind of, you know, this spiral of hostilities, right? And this kind of misperception playing such a big role and, you know, assuming the wrong way, right, about other countries' intentions. And so maybe there's probably something to thinking about that, which might then get to questions about not only reputation and diplomacy and the importance of those things, but also to some of the sort of the psychology, right, of how leaders interact.
Yeah. I mean, we can invoke what is the current theory, dominant theory of war, which is simply to point out that war is not Pareto optimal, just to go back to your point. So we need to know, what is it that stands in the way of bargaining to a solution short of military conflict? And empirically and theoretically, there is no reason, there's no underlying barrier to that. But in reality, there is. And so I think what's important is, and what people in international relations who study these things have been trying to focus on, what exactly is it that impedes a bargained solution when one is clearly, from a logical standpoint, available.
And then we often get to issues of information as important, and the credibility of commitments. And I think that also kind of comes back to your part about cost.
Yep, yep.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Lena. And we're now going to go to break.
Thank you, Hillary. Hope that was what you were looking for.
Very much so. Thank you.
Should I go? Okay, so thank you all. The next paper is going presented by Omar Barbiero, U.S. firms' exposure to import tariffs, a comparison of the 2018 and 2025 episodes. We have 25 minutes.
Okay, sorry, I was just clicking randomly and then we went, okay. All right, hi, thank you very much. This is a paper written jointly with Slavik, Hillary and Alvaro, who are there. There happen to be in the room our excellent research assistants, Sophie and Lilia also, who helped us with this paper. It's, we wrote it for the conference. It's still quite preliminary, and therefore we really value your comments on this. It also, as you can see, involves like 2025 results, which are still very much unfolding. So maybe they're going to be a little disappointing towards the end because we still don't know much about them. So tariffs are back after decades of low trade barriers. The U.S. started increasing import tariffs in 2018. Long-standing taxation tool tariffs now applied to modern advanced economy, as Paul and Shebne were saying, and now apply to like a lot of intermediate inputs in a complicated global network. And so there's many open questions on their effects. Some of the questions from our point of view are, for example, they're still open, the pass-through into consumer prices, real effects on employment or investment, and effects on firms' profitability and financial conditions. Now, we believe in this context that firm-level decisions are relatively understudied in the literature, and they can actually shed some light on some of the above questions, and it's interesting to have a deeper look into them. Okay, so what do we do in the paper? We estimate the effects of 2018 and 2025 tariff episodes on US public companies. And we use four main channels of exposure to tackle, basically, how a trade war is supposed to affect these large US public companies. The first one is pretty straightforward, direct import cost. If we see that a company or its subsidiaries are buying something from abroad that is a tariff category, tariff targeted product, you are exposed. If we see that a company has suppliers that buy targeted products, you are exposed indirectly to that cost. Then, if we see that you are in a sector that has a large share of competitors that come from countries that are targeted to the tariff, you are protected. And finally, if you sell to nations that are retaliating against the US during a trade war episode, then you are exposed because you are exposed to the retaliatory tariff. So we have these four channels that we account for our US public companies, and to compute them, we merge data on imports from bill of lading data, supplier-customer relationships and revenue segmentation from FactSet, and financial information from CompusStat, mainly. So how do we analyze our results? We compare firms with differential exposures within the same industry. So this is really to isolate the economic channels. This is the scope of the paper at the moment. The focus will be on the short term. That's because there's a problem with the 2018 tariff episode that's very close to 2020 when COVID happened. So that tends to distort the results. So for now, at least we focus on basically the effect of the 2018 tariffs until 2019. And then for 2025, things are still very much unfolding. It's a partial equilibrium effect that I'm going to talk about today. So we don't really have a model yet that can generalize things in the general equilibrium. So what do we find? In 2018, higher costs, so the higher cost exposures lead to higher prices. We can observe them indirectly, but the evidence that we have is consistent with an increase in the prices of companies that have experienced higher import costs. Still, though, a decrease in profit margins and investment of these companies, so maybe a partial pass-through here, suggestive evidence of a partial pass-through. Export retaliation leads to lower profit margin, surprisingly also to higher investment, and we're still trying to rationalize this, the mechanism behind this result and its robustness. And for the protectionist exposure of these companies, we don't find any effect. Now, to be fair towards like the argument towards maybe protectionist effects being there is that if they materialize, they might materialize more in the long term, and so far we haven't looked at the long term for these companies in terms of this exposure. For 2025, the story is so far undetectable effects, but the data available to us is until 2025 Q2, so it's very, very early to tell, especially because we observed that the 2018 episodes, most of the large effects actually happen 1 year later. Okay, so I'm going to skip the literature, and I'm just going to give, so this is the roadmap. I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the tariff episodes that we take as comparisons. They're going to be the protagonist of the paper, and then I'm going to say a little bit about the exposures and results later. So two main tariff episodes, in the last, in the last decade, basically, that are clearly identifiable. So in 2018, we show here the cumulative increase in the statutory tariff rates since January of the same year. The US imposed new tariffs between February and September 2018. In the beginning, they were mostly tariff related to single industries like washing machines, solar panels, steel and aluminum. Then towards the end, a wide set of products, but mostly targeted towards China. Towards October, the average tariff rate increase was around 1.5%. Contemporaneously with that, targeted countries generally retaliated tit for tat at the same time. So in the end, we can also see an increase in the average tariff rate of US exports. So this is from the point of view of the exporters, that went up also right around 1.5%. What happened instead in 2025? Similar story, but not quite. As you can see, actually, the scale is not the same in these two graphs. One is 1.5, one is 15. What happens if I adjust the scale? This happens. Much larger average effect. So it's not like the single tariff categories were hit by a much larger shock. The shocks were still 10%, 25% in 2018, experienced by a single category. But what's different in 2025 is that the whole world was affected. And that leads to a much higher average tariff rate increase for US imports. So much broader use of import tariffs, much lower relative retaliation from the targeted countries than in 2018. And that's quite interesting per se to discuss. But this is what we find in the data. This is data that we gather from different countries. Mostly the retaliation comes from Canada and China. That's it. Those are the two only countries that retaliated. So we like to look at these two shocks because they are similar, and we find them mostly similar. They are relatively persistent and unexpected, we believe. In 2018, most of the tariffs that were introduced remained. There's a general feeling that most of the 2025 tariffs are not going away anytime soon. 1 year before they came, I don't think people could have an idea of how big they were going to be or what exact categories were going to be affected. Close in time, right? So the sample of firms that we're going to have in 2018 and 2025 is basically the same. So it's a nice framework, I think, for like a comparison a little bit between the two. And it's interesting, I think, to have a look at them, and even just the exposures. The differences are, of course, also important. 2025, much higher import tariff rate and much lower export retaliation. We find from sentiment analysis in the companies in our sample that the 2025 tariffs are also associated by a much higher level of perceived uncertainty from the point of view of the companies. So that's something to keep in mind. So what do? We gather data on these two tariffs, and for now we take just a snapshot in time, a reference time for the two of them as the shock. So in 2018 we're going to use annual data, and we're just going to use kind of like the end of year tariff shocks in 2018, so as of October, and that's going to be basically for each product and country category. It's going to be, okay, how much the tariff has increased for you since January. And then for 2025, same thing, but as of June 2025, because we have data until that time. So that's basically the reference point we take. So how do we build our measures given the shocks that we observe in the tariff product? How do we build the measures of firms' exposures? These are the 4 measures of firms' exposures. So we have the first one is the import cost. It's defined as the firm-specific tariff increase per unit of costs of the company. This is based on previous year's sourcing from Panjiva bill of lading data. We see that you bought from different countries a certain set of products at a very detailed level. Then we know for each episode how much you should pay, and then that's rescaled by how big the bill is for you in terms of cost of materials. Second measure is the firm-specific average of the import cost of the suppliers. So we have a list of the largest suppliers in these large public companies, and for each of them, we know whether they imported a targeted category or not. Then we can create a measure of import cost for each supplier. And then we take the simple average of the cost of the suppliers that each company has. Why do we take the simple average? We cannot observe the intensity of the link between customer and supplier, and maybe we can talk a bit more about this in the Q&A. This is basically the best data that we have on this indirect cost at the moment. Export retaliation, this is the firm-specific retaliation tariff on foreign sales. So we take the previous year geographic revenue segmentation of a company. That, we believe, is a proxy for how much a certain U.S. company headquartered in the U.S. is potentially exporting to the rest of the world. If that country retaliates against the U.S., then you are exposed to retaliation. And finally, sector protection. This is the measure that maybe still needs the most work because it's at the sector-specific level. So we're still working on it a little bit, but for now we take it from Flynn and Pierce, which is a paper that it's really intellectually indebted to for this one. It's the sector-specific average tariff increase on competitors. So if you have a lot of competitors in your sectors, those competitors have have a large amount of tariffs on them, that's good news for you, actually. So this is the counterbalance of all the previous stories that are kind of like bad news from the point of view of the company. That's good news for you. It's supposed to, now you're supposed to have less competition from the point of view of the company. So this is just some stylized facts on the exposures that we find in our sample. So first of all, the set of companies exposed in 2018 and 2025, at least on the extensive margin, is quite similar. At the core of it, the reason is that if you were exporting to or importing to China in 2018, you were also importing and exporting from the rest of the world in 2025. So actually the companies that are exposed, just 1-0, to the trade war in the two episodes is basically the same. The real difference between the two episodes that we find from the point of view of U.S. companies is the magnitude of the import cost exposure, both direct and indirect, in 2025. The import cost exposure, very concentrated on manufacturing and trade. This is quite intuitive. We also find that there's quite a bit of exposure in the mining, utility, and construction sectors, though. With lower magnitude, but still, even in beyond manufacturing, you find that these companies have direct imports and indirect imports from the rest of the world that are very much affected by tariffs. The indirect measure, it's even more broadly based. So beyond manufacturing, we find many companies with suppliers, right? Even in services that, of course, suppliers might have some manufacturing import, and this goes, I think, in the direction that Shebnem and Paul were saying. Once you go a little bit, look at the input-output table, you'll find more linkages than you expect, even beyond manufacturing. Export retaliation and protection, these two measures are instead very much, this is a story about manufacturing. Of course, there's interesting variation within manufacturing there, but the exposure is mostly just within those sectors in our samples. Of course, these exposures are very correlated with each other. So firms often bear multiple of these exposures. That's why we wanted to account for all of them at the same time in order to isolate the different economic channels and the different economic stories that each of them might have behind their effects. So a bit on the methodology, and then I'll talk about the results. The methodology is pretty straightforward. We want to know how outcomes of exposed firms differ from the other firms. And we want to look at that within industry. So it's a difference in difference specification. We have a dependent variable YFT. So this is for each firm at any given point in time around a window of the episode. And we look at the two episodes separately. So the firm level outcomes that we're going to look at are on the financial side, consolidated costs growth, sales growth, and cash flow change over sales. And then on the real side, capital expenditure, inventory over assets, and employment growth. And then on the right-hand side of the equation, we're going to measure direct cost effect, indirect cost effect, retaliation effect according to the firm-specific exposure, and then with a dummy for the post-episode period. We're going to have an industry time fixed effect, and that implies that we are comparing similar companies within the same industry. We do not include the sector protection effect in this specification because that varies at the industry time level, and so we are controlling for it. In this very specification, we won't have an estimate for that. Then we're going to relax this assumption And we're going to talk about later what we find or don't find for that particular channel. So some of the results. So here the exposures are on the columns and the dependent variables are on the row. Import cost exposure, and all the exposures are standardized, right? So all the coefficients are basically readable by, okay, what's the effect of one standard deviation shock on each of these exposures? So what's the effect of a typical exposure in the sample? One standard deviation higher exposure in import cost leads to a 1.2 percentage point higher cost, 1 percentage point higher sales. These are nominal sales. So how is it possible that higher costs lead to higher sales? That's because it's a nominal sales. So we see this result as kind of meaning that probably the change in sales is due to either a price effect or a quantity effect. Probably the higher sales are due to the price effect being dominant on the volumes effect. Volume may have stayed quite stable, while the price effect instead is doing all the work here. There's a 1.4% cash flow decrease, so that this is also suggestive evidence that still some of the burden of the higher cost has been absorbed by the company's financials. The supplier's cost channel is a bit less robust. It's still the economics like direction move similarly to the import costs. We have other specifications in which instead things look more significant on the supplier's cost, and we believe that's because basically there's a lot of variation absorbed by our strong industry time fixed effects. On the export retaliation side, we only find a strong negative effects on cash flows. So what happens if we relax? Sorry, I'm just, I don't know where to point the clicker. Okay, okay. No, yeah, you see I skipped something. There you go, all right. So what happens if we drop the industry time fixed effects? We just add the time fixed effects. That allows us to measure the protectionist effect towards the end. So all the previous exposure that I showed you, basically the story is the same. We don't find at the moment significant effects from sector protection exposure, but remember that here the sample ends in 2019 for a shock in 2018. Potentially there might be further action on this side, but we're not able to see it at the moment. And then on the real side term, yes, we don't find much on employment growth, not much on inventory change. What we find is responses on the capital expenditure change of the companies that are exposed. Higher direct import costs lead to a 0.2 percentage point lower capital expenditure over assets. Results qualitatively in line, we believe, with Amiti and Weinstein and others. And higher foreign retaliation on exports lead instead to a 0.2 percentage point higher capital expenditure over assets. At the borderline significant, but still we're still thinking about these results. May be related to investments to diversify customer base. That's like a possible way to rationalize higher investment after retaliation. Sector protection, I'm not going to show it, has still no detectable effects on employment or investment. Sorry, okay. How are the results for 2025? Just for transparency, I wanna show you. I think it's too early to really detect anything meaningful in our opinion. It's curious that retaliated firms, so these are firms more exposed to China and Canada retaliation, are doing pretty well in terms of cash flow and sales growth. Still, we know from the 2018 episode that most of the effects come from 2019 and not 2018, so the effects are not contemporaneous, so I think it's just too early to tell here. So just to conclude on the last 3 minutes, this is the last slides, just kind of like I wanted to show some sentiment analysis as kind of a validity test of our exposure, and as kind of possibly a view into the future, as earnings call sentiment sometimes is seen as predicting firms' decisions. So all of our exposure, so we measure basically sentiment. It can be negative sentiment if you mention a tariff with kind of a negative sentiment within the same sentence. Or risk if you mention a tariff and then you say, there is heightened risk for me in like all the possible concept around risk as well are accounted for. So we can see that all of our exposures are correlated with negative and risk sentiment in relation to tariffs in the firms of our sample. Interestingly, even the sector protection measure is correlated with negative sentiment. That's supposed to be good news. We think maybe more work is necessary to assess how we are measuring this protection channel. There might be some underlying correlation here, not related to protection explicitly, or firms are simply not aware that that's good news. That's something interesting to think about, that we're still thinking about. What's interesting in an interesting fact that we found so far is that the 2025 episode appears to have larger effects on negative and risk sentiment. So one standard deviation exposure to direct cost, for example, increases negative sentiment related to tariffs by 0.2% in 2018 and 0.5% in 2025. This is kind of suggesting that the salience of the shock macroeconomically is much higher, perceived to be like much more risky, and firms are like, even though the shock is very high, firms are even like reactive even more than the size of the shock, basically, according to our sample. So to conclude, okay, we create firm-level tariff exposure measures for US listed companies. We find large correlated exposures across sectors, even beyond manufacturing. The 2025 episode is more prominent in terms of import cost magnitudes, but the set of affected firms is actually quite similar to 2018. We find that a higher cost leads to higher prices and lower profit margin in investments. Export retaliation leads to lower profit margins. So far, we don't find any protectionist effect on employment, investment, on profitability of the companies. And for 2025, still early, stay tuned. This is kind of a paper that we wrote for the conference, and we kind of mean to like update regularly, hopefully, and hopefully provide some interesting insights on that. Thank you very much.
So Andrei Levchenko is going to discuss the paper.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this very nice paper. It's a pleasure to be here in Boston. So the overarching goal of this paper and a much bigger research effort that's going on right now is to understand the impact of the Trump tariffs on the U.S. economy, and they can be done at various levels, right? You can try to do it to understand the micro variation, how tariffs have affected different firms, sectors, or individuals, and that's interesting in and of itself, clearly, and it's interesting for some purposes, like if you want to understand the distributional impacts, or if you want to trade stocks of these companies. But I think for most of us, at least in this room, the ultimate prize would be to understand the macro impact of these tariffs on things like GDP and welfare. But of course, the micro results, like the ones in this paper, are an extremely important input into any kind of eventual macro assessment. And hopefully, the way we're going to reach a full picture that includes the macro impacts is to depart from these these results, learn about the relevant elasticities, and then model them so that we can capture general equilibrium effects. So this paper comes in on, I'm having the same problem. It's like a 3-second delay, I'm just gonna count. This paper comes in very firmly on the micro side, so basically it estimates the impacts of tariff shocks on CompuStat firms in both 2018 and 2025. And they examine empirically multiple channels of tariff propagation. So imported intermediates is one, whether direct through the fact that these firms import, or indirect through the fact that they buy things from people that import these inputs, retaliation in foreign markets, whether these firms are present in these foreign markets that are now raising tariffs on U.S. exports, and also protection from import competition. It's like the old school one, right? You raise a tariff and domestic producers benefit. So it's like a very impressive effort. It's a very rich paper that has a tremendous data collection behind it. And Omar was really chill about it. He's like, yeah, you know, we have Panjiva and stuff like that. No, this is like a big effort that they merged Panjiva into CompuStat. They didn't stop there because they also wanted to look at the second round propagation. And so they also merged the FactSet domestic supplier data into CompuStat and into Panjiva. And everything together is allowing them to address a pretty wide range of questions. So kudos for that. I think it's a very impressive effort. Okay, so here's a question. Are discussions and papers complements or substitutes? You can have both sometimes, right? So like a substitute discussion would be, I'm going to go through all the results and I'm going to say how I would do them myself and what I wish was done better or what's convincing or not convincing or whatever. I'm not going to do that. I mean, it's useful sometimes, and you know, we've all done it in the past. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to do a complement discussion, which is that I'm going to pick up where the paper leaves off and take it in a particular direction that the paper doesn't take. And I'm essentially just going to take at face value all the results and so on, and kind of try to understand them, okay? So what am I going to do? So for me, I can't look at these results, at least these days, and just leave them at that. I immediately want to understand how I could insert them in the model, precisely because I think the general equilibrium effects and the aggregate implications are the holy grail here. And that you cannot do without some structure, without some GE. And so to me, these results are interesting because they can speak to what kind of models we should have, what we should be putting in the models, and how we should be calibrating them. And so what I'm going to do is make two comments, essentially, one micro comment and one macro comment that try to interpret what we're seeing in these results. And in particular, kind of the most striking takeaway for me is that following an import price cost shock, which is a negative cost shock, right? The stuff is getting more expensive to produce for these firms. There's both an increase in sales and an increase in cost of goods sold. And the authors kind of comment on it, and they say, briefly, they say something like, yeah, it makes sense, you know, the stuff is getting more expensive, so the cost of goods sold should increase. But there's like a puzzle that even though the cost of goods sold should increase, the sales we feel like should decrease, but they go in the same direction. So I kind of want to examine these claims because I also found them puzzling, but actually I reached the opposite conclusion of what's puzzling. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, so to understand this, right, let's just put some absolute minimal structure. There's a price of firm F, which is a product of the cost per unit little c ft and a markup mft. And then this firm is facing some downward sloping demand that's a function of its price. So Q is quantity sold, P is the price. And sales and goods cost of goods sold have this relationship, right? Sales is markup times cost of goods sold. And therefore, the elasticity of sales with respect to the cost, remember little fc is cost, little cf, is the markup elasticity, so the elasticity of the markup with respect to CFT, plus the elasticity of cost of goods sold with respect to CFT, right? So they only differ by the markup elasticity. And so actually, we shouldn't be at all surprised that the coefficient on sales and cost of goods sold is the same. In fact, if we were in the Melitz world, where markups are constant, this markup elasticity is 0, and the coefficient on sales should be the same as the coefficient of cost of goods sold. In their results, they're differing by something like 0.2. So you could roughly say like the markup elasticity is 0.2, which seems reasonable to me for now. So that part is actually not surprising, that those coefficients are pointing in the same direction. What I find more surprising is the coefficient on cost of goods sold at positive. So let's specialize the demand a little bit, just so that we're all kind of a bit clear what's going on. Let's say demand is CS, and so sigma is the elasticity of demand with respect to price. And then there's some shifter, which is expenditure divided by the price index. So then cost of goods sold has this expression, which is the markup to minus sigma times the cost to the 1 minus sigma times the demand shifter. And the only way that the elasticity of cost of goods sold to the cost is positive is if the markup elasticity is less than 1 over sigma minus 1, right? And you gotta kind of see what's happening. The cost is increasing because they're facing import tariffs. So if the markup is not moving, right? If the markup elasticity is 0, like in Melitz, cost of goods sold are going to fall with an elasticity of 1 minus sigma, and sigma has to be bigger than 1, so it has to be negative. So the only hope that the cost of goods sold is going to increase is if you have a very large markup elasticity. That if you increase your costs, the markup go down so much that still you sort of increase the quantity produced, right? And so can it be? So I reached for the Atkinson-Bernstein model, which is the textbook kind of variable elasticity model. So this is the Atkinson-Bernstein markup. So sigma is the elasticity of demand, rho is the elasticity of demand in the upper nest, and S is the share of the firm in its own sector. And then there's a kind of more complicated expression for markup elasticity. And you kind of need to be at that lower line, 1 over sigma minus 1. And this is the markup elasticity when sigma equals 5 and rho equal to 2, which is kind of like a vanilla calibration that I think most of us can agree on. And it just doesn't get there. So right now, I don't have a theory for how can it be that the cost of goods sold goes up. You can try, this is directly the COGS elasticity, right? You need to kind of be above, to match the results, you need to be above 0. I tried like a bunch of different elasticities, it doesn't work. So it's not a theorem that there is no markup elasticity in this environment, that meaning there's no combination of sigma and rho, that it's impossible, but I couldn't find one. So I think that's puzzling. So what could be going on? I don't know what could be going on. So here's some possibilities. One is that demand is inelastic, so sigma is actually less than 1. That would give you that. But we don't know how to think of imperfectly competitive firm with demand, or at least I don't, with demand elasticity less than 1. Could it be that there's like the sector fixed effect is not imposed at the right level of sectoral disaggregation, right? So if instead you had like an upper sector nest, and that's where the fixed effect was, that's this delta ST, in which case the elasticity that's being estimated net of the fixed effect is of this composite object that has the markup, the cost, and the relative price. That would require relative price to move a lot, though. Could it be that this cost of goods sold includes exports? So really what you're selling is not domestically but also internationally, that would still require that to move in a particular way, which is that would require you to increase exports. So to experience like a positive demand shock for your exports that is coinciding with your negative cost shock. Or maybe it's timing. Maybe cost of goods sold are just not measured at the same time period as the cost differential that's being incurred with these tariffs. I just don't know. So these are all questions. But the bottom line is, as of now, at least I don't have a model that can speak to these results. So it's going to be difficult then to take the next step and develop a theoretical framework that can match them. Okay. Now, very quickly on the macro, so we have our price, we have our demand. If we were to go down to the road to writing down a model, what would be the next couple of equations that we will write down? Well, we would specify this cost, right? So this cost would be something like CES in the wage and the price of intermediate inputs. This is this. And then the price of intermediate inputs could involve some CES aggregation of all the stuff you're buying from other firms. And then we'll write down what the expenditure is, and this expenditure is going to have some aggregate expenditure that will include some tariff revenue. And so when I think of how to approach this, right, I would need some shares and some elasticities. This paper is actually very good on shares because it has a ton of these shares of who's buying from whom, where the costs are going up, and so on. So you can do Hut algebra very easily with this, with the data on shares that they have. But they don't have elasticities. And so the question is, can this data be used to try to measure some of these elasticities, right? Can we measure the elasticity substitution between the different inputs so that we know when the tariff cost shock hits, how the different shares are changing and how the unit costs are changing, right? Or the elasticity substitution between inputs and value added, the same thing. It cannot be done with the current specification, I don't think. I checked. I tried to derive what they're currently doing, and all the elasticity falls out because it's the first order. To first order, they don't matter, but there might be a way to get at them. Okay, so that's basically what I have to say. I think it's an exciting effort. It's a very impressive data collection and rich set of results. I think on the micro side, we probably could benefit from understanding a little bit what's going on and how can sales and cost of goods sold increase in response to these shocks. And we're still some distance from the macro, but I think these data are a potentially nice setting to make some progress to put some of these micro estimates in the service of macro assessment. Thank you.
Do you want to reply to his comments?
Yes, thank you very much for the great discussion. We're gonna look at the math carefully. Thanks for going through that. The way I think it's definitely very interesting to think about it. We thought about it as well, like how can COGS and sales move so one-to-one with each other. The intuition that we have is also the only way to explain it in the simple way for now. For us, it's via very low elasticity, basically. So quantities kind of like stay constant, basically. And now you have COGS go up just because your marginal cost goes up, right? You have to pay more now. There's a tariff there. So now the same thing that you were paying yesterday is more expensive. Well, you still buy it. You still sell it, you pass through most of the cost, basically. Now you point out that we can do much more, yeah, with the, and yeah, we're planning to. So yeah, we're going to look into that very carefully. And yes, the dream is to eventually have some welfare implication. We're not quite there yet, but. That's the hope. Thank you very much.
Okay, we can take questions for the audience. Tommaso, please wait for the mic to arrive.
Okay. So thank you, Omar. Thanks for the. I think the presentation was very interesting. I think the effort also is very important. And thanks to Andrei for a great discussion, because I'm pleased that Andrei brought up the issue of markups, because throughout your presentation, so that was resonating in my mind and thinking, so why isn't he telling me what's happening to markups? Is it because there is, of course, we know there are measurement issues, and that's a sort of a complicated endeavor, but we also know that now we have good techniques to tease out markups from the data. And so, yeah, so the question on the empirical side is, tell us more about, if any, is going on markups, or if there is anything you can tell us already. Because I believe that's critical to understand some of the channels. And as Andrei was very correctly pointing out, the second is a note. So on the 2018 episode, what are we learning more that maybe we didn't know from Cavallo and Gopinath, or maybe you're extending the analysis and so on, but that's just a curiosity. And third, I was thinking, so maybe you could look, maybe you did look at whether the effect of tariffs vary across firms depending on financial conditions. Okay, so that some firms, well, it might be a function of size, but depending on indicators of financial conditions, they can actually sort of eat profit margins from tariffs, and again, here the behavior of markups is relevant, as opposed to firms that actually are in tight financial conditions, that actually might be more affected in terms of, and they have to sort of change prices. So the pass-through would be different and larger in the second case, depending on the degree of health and financial conditions. Yeah.
Thank you, Tommaso. Sebrem has a question.
Thank you. Okay, this is a great paper, and I fully agree with Andrea that this is actually huge work. So you didn't even mention, but we are also now matching Panjiva to a larger set of firm and fact set and pitch book to also other countries, and it's very, very difficult. Actually, we are stumbling on many walls, which is why I'm going to ask this question. First of all, what is the match rate you have? Because we tried very hard to go to 90% match rate. That's my first question. And then the second, how do you deal with the trucks? Because of late, and we realize a lot of the Mexico Canada truck thing is missed, and we had to do a lot of work on that because that really affects the match rate. So what are you doing on that? And finally, and we are also working exactly what Andrea said, because this is a great way to do the elasticities, which is what we want to put in our model, of course, because we have all those elasticities in the model. So I definitely recommend you to do the same thing. The more the merrier, the more people work on that. But I'm very curious about how you deal with that, the whole truck issue and the match.
Okay, Paul Antras.
Very cool, and I'm sure the paper will evolve and it's going to go in great directions. The question I have is pretty narrow. I'm not sure I understood the tariff data you're using. I know it's at the sector level, so it wasn't very clear whether it was announced tariffs or actually effective tariffs defined as collected duties over import volumes. In any case, we know there's a lot of exemptions. I mean, why effective rates are lower than announced one is because many companies are actually got exemptions or found ways not to pay the tariffs. And I do worry that is not random, especially when working with CompuStat, large companies. So I don't know if you've given any thought about potential biases there having to do with heterogeneity and actual impact.
Okay, Aaron?
Great, this is really cool to see. I have three quick comments. So, for the firm level sector protection, I could imagine you creating measures where you're taking the industry of the firm to match with the tariff rates. Now, you have to be a little careful there because obviously these are big firms that have multiple establishments with multiple industries. And so there's ways in which you can take establishment level directories to match to the firm and get the full scope of industries that incorporate the firm. So that's one way of kind of getting down that road for a firm level sector protection measure. Second, on this cost of goods sold to sales, in our paper with Justin, we have this input cost channel at the industry level moving to PPIs, which is an output price measure. And interestingly there, that coefficient is greater than 1, which may correspond to some of the things that you're seeing. The way we've interpreted that in our paper was saying, well, we're measuring it as the import share of costs that are affected by tariffs, but you could imagine that some of those industries, domestic sources of supply, also went up in costs. And that's why, for us, the coefficient could have been greater than 1. Domestic steel went up in cost, whether you were importing it or sourcing it from domestic varieties. I'm not sure if that's the same thing for you, but that's how we interpreted that very similar effect that we had in our paper. And then finally, you have the Kuopeng-Jiva data at the firm level. You might imagine that firms may have a lower cost shock, particularly in 2018, if they were sourcing some of these products from China and from a non-China location where they had a better ability to substitute to get around the tariff costs. And so, you have that data and could look at whether or not there's some variation there you could look into.
The next question, David, and in the back. Okay.
Thanks. I thought this was a really interesting paper, and so it was related to a paper that Mary and Mathieu Gomez and I and Sang Kung had done. I had a couple of sorry, a few of these are just some detailed questions. Like when we did the same matching, we couldn't figure out the exact firm level tariffs because a lot of times the bill of lading data didn't seem to have detailed HS6 codes, and so I just kind of and so I just wondered how you handled that. Often we had to just we could identify if you were an importer from China, but we couldn't identify the HS6. Similarly, I was a little confused by how you did the revenues from China because, like for us, we split exports and foreign sales, but it seems like you lump that together, and so the tariffs may not. One reason you may be having some issues in terms of how the tariffs affect things is that they're going to have different impacts on firms depending on whether you're selling in China or not. Another thing that you might want to also include, just to kind of maybe help with the discussant's comments, is you use the FactSet data, which is good, but also the Capital IQ data gives you subsidiaries, and so for some of the firms that might be data to use. That said, I was particularly struck by a different part of the paper, which I thought was really neat, which is it seems like you're getting really big impacts on firm level cash flows. And so you might want to, so in our paper, what we do is we try to extract what the market thinks is happening to cash flows. And, but you guys are looking directly at the movements in cash flows. And it might be good to compare those two numbers. Like are the markets accurately predicting what's going to happen to the cash flows? It looked like your numbers were not that far from our numbers, which I thought was pretty good, but I had to do a few calculations to kind of convert them into ours. So that would be kind of an interesting thing. So I really liked that part of the paper. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Thank you. Can I?
There are
I
two
think
more.
the stock
Okay.
is getting.
Is increasing? Okay.
It's getting high. I don't know if. Okay.
Maybe one
I
last
hope
question.
I took good
Okay.
notes. I want to make sure I answer well.
Just one last question, because
So
he was waiting.
Comment and a question on the result about sales. So I think first as a comment, to me, the hypothesis that there's inelastic demand is actually very natural, and so I'd encourage you to focus on that more. Alexander McKay and Nate Miller have a paper showing that price sensitivity of U.S. consumers has gone down a lot over time, and I think the story of the inflation that we just had is that people still kept consuming. My question is, it seems that those results imply perfect pass-through to the buyers into sales, and so I was wondering how you reconcile that with the work of Jenny Tang and co-authors showing that there's no pass-through, at least in some large retailers. Thanks.
Okay, maybe you can respond to the
Okay.
first
I'll try to be
45
quick
questions.
so that if there's more, I'm so happy that we have all this feedback. So a lot of this stuff is in our to-do list already. Tommaso, markups, we haven't computed them yet. We want to make sure that we do them right. We see the cash flow result. That's kind of a measure of markup. It's a cash flow margin a bit, so it's very imperfect. It's not perfect. But one other measure of markups that we have seems to be going in the same direction of cash flow, but simply haven't done it yet. How do we rationalize our funding with Cavallo Gopinath and Jenny Tang? So what they look at is the effects on border prices, and they find full pass-through, and then there's the effect on consumer prices, and that's the pass-through to consumption, and that's pretty low. This is a different sample that was kind of like on retail goods. Specifically, I have actually another paper with Hillary that looks at the pass-through into PCE that uses industry level data and tries to account for the full network effect of import cost also via intermediaries. And with industry level data, we actually find close to full pass-through, actually. So I think there's a little bit of tension in the literature right now when you use micro-level data, very micro at the product level versus industry-level data. This is a different sample. I feel like this paper is kind of like in between, actually, the super micro and the super industry. So maybe there you go. The answer is also a little bit in between them. That's the best I can say for now. There's still a lot of open questions, as I said in the beginning. Effect depending on financial conditions, yes, it's in the to-do list, especially when we start going towards the mechanisms. We wonder, for example, if the lower investments are due to they can be due to many things, right? It could be the cash flow going down, and that's driven by financially constrained firms. It could be an uncertainty effect that is also contemporaneous, usually with a trade war, so we have to look more into that. Shebnem, I don't know the match rate off the top of my head. We try to match the full master file of Capital IQ with a full master file of FactSet. And Capital IQ has, for some reason, a lot of also like companies that FactSet doesn't have. So I think you have to, we can talk about it, like how to what kind of exact match rate, like how to even compute it. But it's pretty good with the very large companies and with their suppliers, which are usually very large as well. But there's also a lot of private companies, of course. Trucks we include, so Panjiva has Mexican data, right? Mexican data on exports does have the information on whoever is buying it. So we do include land trade and air trade via Mexico, but not for Canada. Yeah. So that's kind of good, actually, that we don't have them at all. And yes, thanks for the suggestion on elasticities. The tariff data that we use is statutory, not as announced. This is for you, Paul. Not as announced, but implemented. We do account for all the exemptions, non-stacking rules, and all of that. We are keeping track of everything for 2025 and for 2018. The exemptions, though, that we account for are like product level exemptions, not firm level exemptions. And so that I have to think about the non-randomness of it, actually, and how it can, it's really deep questions that I don't want to say something wrong here, but thanks. Aaron, thanks for your comment and suggestions on the protection. We'll look into that. We try to basically account for like, okay, for indirect linkages, maybe inflating that coefficient by having the supplier linkages, basically. Fun fact, we put it in a footnote in our appendix, but if you compute our a pass-through very similar to your paper on import cost, you get a coefficient that is almost coinciding with your paper. So that was like, oh, very nice for us, I guess. But it is puzzling that it's much higher than 1, and so that's still some work to do on there to rationalize it. And David, so yes, so the revenue, the retaliation as only revenues for now, and then we just look at like U.S. headquartered companies. So it's a proxy for exports, but it doesn't coincide necessarily with exactly an export. When there, I would love to talk to you to understand how exactly to improve this measure. And we do use Capital IQ data over time, actually, to understand the subsidiary linkages. So when we say direct cost, it can be either a subsidiary buying or the parent company, and anybody in the ownership linkages could buy, and we just aggregate that up, and that's basically, we only have ultimate parent companies in the sample. Yeah, I think I answered.
Okay, so we have more questions. Peter, Schott.
Nice paper, and I thought it was really cool that you had that rich set of exposures. And so one idea, riffing on what David said, was a validation test. So you have stock price movements, and especially in the 2025 round, when tariffs are changing, they're bouncing around like crazy. You could validate the exposure measures because not everyone is going to be hit in the same way when the different tariffs are moving around depending upon their exposures. That might be a way to kind of validate.
Yeah, and that goes in line with also what David asked us to do. And yes, also in the to-do list. Yeah, I know that you guys have a paper and you show that you have kind of like a little bit of these measures, right? But you look at returns and then you validate if the returns are moving correctly, roughly with that, and then we should also validate if our measure coincide with the return response. I agree.
Caroline?
Yeah, so my question was related to the tariffs and how you measured the tariffs, because it seems like your cost increase, you're partly getting it from the cost of inputs increase, assuming that part of that is from the tariffs, but it could be quality, if I'm not, in terms of how you're doing it, I think, which could explain the overall revenue increase. But
could be quality, you said?
So we used to think prices of goods were actually quality. So now we don't think that anymore when we're doing this kind of stuff. But what if the quality of the inputs had gone up? That could explain why you end up selling more. So, but it just seems, it depends on how you're measuring the tariffs, but from what I understood in how you're measuring them, that seems like it might get mixed up in there, and I was just curious about that.
Okay, I think this one was the last question. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Omar and Andrei.